Imagine a world where faith burns brighter than reason, where men and women abandon everything they know to chase a promise beyond the horizon. A world trembling between salvation and madness, where the whisper of a distant call would set millions of hearts in motion and reshape the destiny of continents. Tonight we travel back to the very first crusade, a journey of hunger, holiness, and haunting silence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, let the story begin. Before the year 1095, Europe slept uneasily beneath a sky the color of pewter. Fields stretched outward like tired quilts, stitched with hedgerows and broken walls from forgotten wars. Seasons came and went with little mercy. In some years, crops failed beneath endless rain. In others, drought hardened the soil to stone. Famine was not a catastrophe, but a rhythm, known to every village and monastery alike. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet earth, and the bells that tolled across the valleys carried not joy but endurance. The continent was a mosaic of lords and loyalties, fragile and shifting. In the north, the Normans had recently conquered England, their castles rising from muddy plains like teeth. In the south, the Moors still held the Iberian Peninsula, their cities bright with science and poetry. Between these edges lay the Holy Roman Empire, France and the Italian states, places bound by language and faith, but divided by ambition. Each count, bishop and knight guarded his small domain as if it were the world entire. Yet beneath this patchwork of power, the people shared one thing that reached beyond borders: the church. Its presence seeped into every hour of the day. Stone chapels dotted the countryside, and monasteries stood as islands of order amid the chaos of feudal life. Monks copied manuscripts in the dim glow of candles, their ink freezing in winter, their thoughts turning to eternity. Pilgrims wandered roads, leading to distant shrines, Compostela, Rome, Canterbury, seeking forgiveness or healing. In their prayers, the Holy Land was not a faraway place, but the heart of creation, shimmering somewhere beyond imagination. The 11th century was an age of superstition and reverence. Comets were taken as omens, storms as divine warnings, disease as punishment. The plague still haunted memory. The Black Death was yet to come, but local pestilence and leprosy made people whisper of sin. In quiet villages, tales of relics circulated, bones that glowed faintly, cloths that wept, saints who healed the faithful in dreams. These stories drifted through taverns and monasteries alike, carrying with them a restlessness that words could not ease. Over time, the restlessness deepened. Knights, bred for war, found themselves idle in long years of uneasy peace. Their swords, meant for conquest, turned too often against neighbors. In France and the Rhineland, feuds ignited over boundary stones and dowries. Castles burned, fields lay trampled. The church tried to restrain this violence with decrees known as the Peace and Truce of God, oaths sworn to protect peasants and holy places, but human hunger for purpose outlasted sermons. Many knights confessed their sins with blood still on their hands, unable to find redemption in the quiet of the chapel. Beyond Europe's borders, the Eastern world shimmered like a rumor. Merchants and pilgrims returned from Constantinople and Antioch with stories of vast cities, silk markets and lands where prophets once walked. They spoke of the Byzantine Empire, ruled by the clever emperor Alexios the Furic Pomnenos, whose golden mosaics caught the sunlight like fire. Yet they also whispered of danger: the Seljuk Turks, who had seized much of Asia Minor and now threatened the roads to Jerusalem. In 1071, the Byzantine army had been crushed at Manzikert, and since then, the pilgrimage routes through Anatolia had become perilous. Still, the idea of Jerusalem lingered. For centuries, Christians had journeyed to the Holy Sepulchre, often welcomed by Muslim rulers who valued trade and stability. But by the late 11th century, those who returned spoke of increased hardship, of taxes, harassment, and closed gates. Whether these tales were truth or exaggeration hardly mattered. They stirred the imagination of a continent already searching for meaning. Within the monasteries, chroniclers began to describe the East not simply as a land of relics, but as a wound, a sacred place in peril. The songs of pilgrims shifted in tone, no longer mere hymns of devotion, but laments for what had been lost. In parchment margins, monks painted crude maps of the world, with Jerusalem at the center, its streets radiating outward like veins. To them, the city was not only a destination but a symbol of balance. If the holy city fell to unbelievers, the world itself might tilt into chaos. The papacy too was changing. Only decades earlier, popes had struggled against emperors and local lords for authority. The reforms of Pope Gregory VII had begun to reshape the church into a force beyond kingdoms, a power that could command kings rather than obey them. When Urban II ascended to the papal throne in 1088, he inherited both ambition and opportunity. He dreamed of uniting Christendom under one purpose, ending the endless wars among Christian nobles by turning their swords toward a single sanctified cause. Meanwhile, word from the east reached him through desperate letters from Emperor Alexios III. The Byzantines, pressed by the Seljuk Turks, begged for help, not from an army of zealots, but from disciplined mercenaries to reclaim lost lands. Alexios sought assistance. He did not yet know he was inviting a storm. In the marketplaces of Europe, rumor carried more swiftly than truth. Tales of suffering Christians, desecrated shrines, and cruel invaders passed from town to town, growing heavier with each retelling. In Paris, in Mainz, in the villages along the Rhine, people began to imagine themselves as defenders of God's realm. Preachers spoke of a new kind of pilgrimage, one taken not with walking staves, but with swords blessed by priests. They told their listeners that to die in such a cause would mean instant salvation, forgiveness of all sins. For souls weary of sin and poverty, such promises shone brighter than any earthly treasure. So the murmur began, soft at first, then spreading like wind through a forest, a holy journey, a cleansing war, a chance for redemption not in cloistered silence but through sacrifice. From cloisters to castles, from peasants to princes, the same thought stirred that perhaps the world's suffering could be healed by marching east. The roads remained muddy, the harvest uncertain, the sky perpetually grey. But in the stillness of those years before 1095, something invisible gathered strength. It was not yet a movement, only a longing, a slow tightening of the heart across a continent that did not yet know it was waiting for a call. The prayers of monks rose like mist through the rafters, mingling with the scent of beeswax and incense, and somewhere in that mixture of faith and fatigue, the first echo of a crusade took shape. And when the echo grew strong enough, it reached the ears of one man, a pope in a far-off city, who would soon give it voice. The year turns cold. The roads of central France are thick with mud, and the breath of early winter drifts like pale smoke across the hills of Auvergne. Pilgrims, bishops, and nobles arrive from every direction, their cloaks dusted with frost, their horses steaming in the dawn air. They come to the small city of Clermont, drawn by a summons from Rome itself. For days the streets have filled with murmurs. Some say a great reform will be announced. Others whisper that the East has fallen, and Christendom must act. No one yet knows that the gathering will change the shape of centuries. Within the city walls, Pope Urban II moves through the chill corridors of the cathedral complex. He is not a young man, nor yet old, his face carved by years of discipline and exile. Born Odo of Lagery, once a monk of Cluny, he carries the quiet confidence of one who has spent his life amid prayer and argument. Since taking the papal throne in 1088 he has travelled widely, strengthening reform, binding the church closer to Rome, and reclaiming authority lost to emperors. Now, with the Byzantine plea for help lying before him, he sees a path by which faith, politics, and salvation might all converge. Outside the cathedral, the air is heavy with anticipation. It is late November 1095, by some accounts the 27th day, and the countryside stands bare, the harvest long stored away. In an open field beyond the city, platforms have been raised, and on them the papal banners hang limp in the cold breeze. The crowd is vast, bishops and abbots in wool and fur, knights with mail hidden under cloaks, peasants and townsfolk pressed together, their faces lifted toward the dais. A hush spreads slowly, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Urban steps forward. His voice is not the roar of a conqueror, but the measured cadence of a monk trained in liturgy. Yet the words carried by interpreters and rumor alike ripple outward with a force no one can quite explain. He speaks first of sin, the feuds that have bled the lands of France, the greed that stains the nobility, the neglect of holy things. He reminds them that their swords meant to defend the innocent have too often slain brothers. Then his tone shifts, turning eastward, toward Constantinople and Jerusalem. He tells them of Christians in the east, besieged and oppressed, of the Church of St. Sophia despoiled, of pilgrims beaten and robbed on the road to the Holy Sepulchre. Some of these tales are true, others shaped by exaggeration, but in the gathering frost they sound like revelation. He describes the Turks and Saracens as destroyers of altars, desecrators of the faithful. He paints the holy city as a wounded heart calling for aid. The crowd listens, the chill forgotten, as the image of Jerusalem, distant, glowing, half-imagined, takes hold of them. Then Urban offers the promise that will echo for generations. Whoever goes to defend that land in pure devotion, whoever takes up arms, not for glory, but for God, shall receive the full remission of sins. A pilgrimage, he calls it, armed yet holy. A path by which even the violent might find absolution. He names no king, commands no army. Instead he releases an idea into the air, light as breath, indestructible as faith. The field erupts. Chroniclers will later disagree on the exact words, but all recall the cry that rises from thousands of throats. Deus vult, God wills it. The phrase surges through the assembly like flame through dry grass. Men tear strips from their cloaks to form crosses, pinning them to their shoulders. Bishops bless them, voices trembling. The sound carries over the walls of Clermont and into the countryside beyond, where peasants pause in their work, hearing an echo they cannot explain. That night, campfires dot the fields. Snow begins to fall, soft and relentless, hissing as it touches the embers. Beneath the white silence, decisions take root. Some vow to sell their lands, others to leave families and debts behind. It is said that Urban himself spends the evening in prayer, unaware that his sermon has already grown beyond control. He had hoped for a measured response, a disciplined force to aid Byzantium. Instead, something vast and unpredictable begins to stir, a spiritual migration wrapped in the armor of war. In the following days, Urban meets privately with nobles and clerics. He entrusts bishops to carry his message across Europe, to Tours, to Limoges, to Nimes, to Cologne and Mainz. Each is to preach the same indulgence, the same holy journey. He issues letters formalizing what he has spoken, careful in tone, but the oral retellings outrun the parchment. By winter's end, every road hums with the rumor of salvation through travel and battle. Outside the papal circle, stories mutate. Some claim angels were seen above the field of Clermont, shining in approval. Others insist that the Pope promised eternal paradise to any who took the cross. Chroniclers write as though a new sun had risen over Christendom. The notion of Jerusalem as both destination and redemption begins to weave itself into the hearts of men who have never seen a map. Meanwhile, in castles across France and Lorraine, lords begin to measure what they can sell. Armorers work through the night. Merchants calculate prices for grain and steel. Even those too poor to own a sword speak of joining the pilgrimage. Women gather relics and rosaries for departing husbands. Priests bless the first crude crosses cut from red cloth. The snow melts into mud, and in that mud the footprints of the coming crusade already form. Urban continues his journey north, repeating his call in city after city. Wherever he preaches, crowds swell beyond the squares, spilling into fields and hillsides. He reminds them that Christ himself was a pilgrim, that the road to salvation is walked, not inherited. He He urges peace among those who remain behind, decreeing that their lands be protected under the truce of God, and still the enthusiasm grows. The papal couriers cannot keep pace with the spreading fervor. By spring, songs of the cross fill the taverns. Jongleurs compose verses about the Holy Road, mixing Latin prayers with the language of the streets. Children play at crusade with wooden sticks. Beggars paint small red crosses on their rags, hoping for alms. The idea has become a current no authority can contain. In every heart it shapes itself differently. Penance, adventure, deliverance, escape. Yet all point east, toward a city most could not even locate. And so, as the last frost recedes from the fields of France, the echo of Clermont continues its slow march across the continent. The Pope's words have taken on a life of their own, whispering through cloisters and across market squares, from noble halls to thatched cottages. Europe, once numb with weariness, begins to stir, its dreams newly aflame. Somewhere, in the distance, the first travellers begin to pack their bundles, to gather water flasks and bread, to tie bits of red cloth to their tunics. The movement has begun, though none yet understand what it will cost. The voice that rose in the chill of November will soon become 1,000 voices carried by the wind, each repeating the same uncertain promise that salvation lies to the east. And from these whispers and preparations, from the spreading hum of belief, the awakening of the cross begins to take form. Across the winter fields of France, the echo of Clermont moves like thawing water through furrows and valleys. Word of the papal call travels faster than any courier, carried by merchants, wandering monks, and the songs of pilgrims returning from shrines. In towns where parchment is scarce and few can read, the message takes shape in voices, gestures, and rumor that the Pope himself has promised forgiveness to all who journey east to free Jerusalem. The phrasing changes with every retelling, yet the heart of it remains, a road to salvation that begins with the taking of the cross. At first it is the lesser clergy who repeat Urban's words. Parish priests, unused to commanding crowds, find themselves preaching to entire villages gathered beneath bare trees. They raise simple wooden crucifixes above their heads and speak of Christ's tomb, of the suffering of Christians beyond the sea, of a pilgrimage more sacred than any before. As they speak, people step forward to receive pieces of cloth dyed red, scraps torn from mantles, sewn hastily into small crosses. Each is blessed and pinned to the shoulder as a mark of devotion. The gesture spreads until it becomes instinctive, a sign shared by rich and poor alike. In castles and manors the same symbol appears in more elaborate form. Noble women embroider crosses of crimson silk onto the cloaks of their husbands and sons, often weeping as they do. Chroniclers will later record that the first to take the cross among the lords were men such as Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Hugh of Vermandois, each for reasons that blend faith and ambition. They swear oaths to journey east by August of 1096, each promising to bring armed retainers and provisions for years. Yet beyond their halls, an uncounted multitude also begins to move. Peasants, artisans, widows, and wandering knights without masters, all convinced that heaven itself has opened a path before them. By early spring, the roads fill with people. From the valleys of the Rhine to the plains of Lombardy, streams of travellers converge toward the Alps and the Rhine crossings. Their possessions are few: bundles of bread and dried peas, wooden cups, a staff, perhaps a borrowed sword. They walk in groups for safety, praying as they go. Children ride on ox carts. Women carry infants wrapped in linen. To many it feels less like war than pilgrimage. Their songs speak of Jerusalem as though it lies just beyond the next hill. Behind them lie debts cancelled by confession, and the hope that every hardship ahead will count as penance. Lords sell or mortgage lands to raise funds. Peasants simply abandon fields. A strange equality grows among them, forged by the promise that each step taken for God erases sin. The feudal world loosens, just slightly, under the pressure of devotion. In monasteries, scribes watch the movement with awe and anxiety. Some see in it divine renewal, the laity awakened to holiness, others fear madness. Reports reach Cluny, Limoges, and Cologne of bands too large to feed themselves, of preachers without license gathering thousands, yet the papal message, once released, cannot be recalled. Urban continues to travel and preach through France, urging order, naming August of the coming year as the time for departure, but many refuse to wait. They believe delay would mean disobedience to the will of God. The symbol of the Red Cross acquires meanings beyond what Urban intended. For knights it becomes a banner of holy knighthood, for the poor, a charm against hunger and danger, for widows, a token that their sacrifice is known to heaven. At crossroads and markets, traders sell small metal badges in the shape of the cross. Churches ring bells when new groups set out, blessing them with psalms and holy water. Everywhere the language of war mingles with the rituals of pilgrimage, a fusion that neither side of the altar quite understands. Not all who take the cross are moved purely by faith. Some see in the crusade a chance for land or plunder, for escape from debt, for release from the cycles of feudal obligation. Others are driven by fear, fear of damnation if they ignore the Pope's call, fear of being left behind when the world's final judgment seems so near. Apocalyptic rumors spread with the pilgrims, that the end of days will follow the recovery of Jerusalem, that Christ himself will appear upon its walls. Such beliefs, impossible to prove or disprove, fill the air with expectation. Through Lent and Easter of 1096, the contagion of belief intensifies. Chroniclers describe villages emptied overnight, mills silent, and fields left unsown. In Lorraine, Peter the Hermit, a small ascetic priest said to have been at Clermont, begins to preach with unearthly passion. Barefoot, riding a mule, he moves from town to town, showing a letter he claims came from heaven, or perhaps from the East itself. Crowds follow him, convinced that through his voice God has spoken again. Behind him trail peasants carrying banners painted with crude crosses, shouting hymns in languages no scholar can standardize. To them, Peter is not a leader of an army, but the guide of a new exodus. Governments and bishops try to impose order. Councils remind the faithful that only those prepared and provisioned should depart, that discipline, not frenzy, must guide the holy enterprise. Yet, the momentum is beyond control. In the Rhineland, entire communities pledge themselves. In Italy, pilgrims gather at Lucca and Piacenza. In Germany, nobles organize fleets for transport down the Danube. Each region imagines the journey differently, but all share the same starting point, the moment when the Red Cross touched cloth and turned faith into motion. The spring rains come, rivers rise, washing over bridges crowded with travelers. The smell of damp wool and sweat mingles with incense from processions blessing the departing. Some groups pause at shrines, believing miracles accompany them. A blind man said to have regained sight at a roadside cross, a cripple who walks unaided after vowing to go east. Whether true or not, these stories multiply, feeding the sense that heaven walks beside them. By early summer, the highways are no longer roads but living streams of humanity. Europe, so long fragmented by war and lordship, moves for the first time toward a single horizon. From high in their towers, nobles watch columns of people vanish into distance. Farmers, craftsmen, widows, children, the smell of dust rising behind them. Even those who remain behind feel the pull of the East in their prayers. For a moment the continent seems united not by empire or coin, but by yearning. The Red Cross, no larger than a hand, has bound millions through shared imagination. Yet, beneath the hymns and blessings, unease flickers. How will so many feed themselves? Who will keep order among the untrained and the poor? The Church's planners speak of appointed leaders and departure dates, but the first waves have already gone, following Peter the Hermit and other wandering prophets toward an unknown destiny. The awakening of the cross has become movement, the movement now a tide. From the quiet fields of France to the river towns of Germany and the hill roads of Italy, that tide begins to roll eastward. It carries within it faith and desperation, courage and confusion, the full weight of a civilization seeking its reflection in a distant city of stone and light. And so from these swelling crowds the first true march begins, not of kings or generals, but of common souls, unarmed save for hope, moving toward a horizon they can scarcely imagine. The roads leading east from the Rhine, the Moselle and the valleys of France swell with humanity. It is the spring of 1096, and the land is dotted with travelers carrying bundles tied with fraying rope, small knives, bread hardened by weeks in sacks, and tiny crosses pinned to their chests or tied to cloaks. Many cannot read, few have ever seen a map, yet they move with a singular purpose, each step guided by faith, each breath a measure of hope. At their head walks Peter the Hermit, a man of slight frame and austere countenance, barefoot and wrapped in simple wool, his eyes bright with conviction. He is not a general, nor does he possess knowledge of war or logistics. Yet in his voice, trembling and impassioned, the peasant multitude hears the call of heaven itself. The march begins in disorder. Families separate and reunite with difficulty. Streams of people follow faint trails across swollen rivers, through dense forests and over hills still sodden with spring rain. Their shoes are thin, their feet blistered, their clothing insufficient for nights that remain chill. Hunger gnaws quietly but persistently, stealing strength, dulling senses, leaving a constant ache in the belly. Yet still they press forward, singing psalms, murmuring prayers, repeating the name of Christ, believing every step brings them closer to salvation and to the distant, imagined streets of Jerusalem. As they traverse towns and villages, the column of travelers grows. Some are beggars and vagabonds, seeking adventure or relief from toil. Others are artisans abandoning their workshops, believing the journey will cleanse their souls. Among them are minor knights with little training, compelled less by strategy than by hope of absolution. The unifying mark is the red cross, pinned with care, a symbol that gives even the weakest courage to endure the long, treacherous roads. In towns along the way, curious locals offer small alms, a loaf of bread, a flask of water, and the travelers move on before dusk, leaving behind trails of dust and footprints pressed into softened earth. Yet the march is not merely a movement of bodies, it is also a movement of confusion, impatience and fragile order. Without leaders capable of enforcing discipline, the peasant multitude drifts toward villages at night, seeking food and shelter where none may exist. Hunger forces theft from markets and farmsteads, and fear drives retaliation. Chroniclers will later describe massacres in the Rhineland, where local Jewish communities, long established, were attacked by crusaders convinced, erroneously, tragically, that such acts were sanctified by the cross. These early weeks of the People's Crusade are marked not only by devotion but by a fog of moral uncertainty, desperation, and human failure, a grim echo of the chaos inherent in a movement guided more by faith than reason. Traveling through the forests of Lorraine and the plains of Hungary, the marchers contend with natural obstacles that sap their strength. Rivers swollen by spring melt are crossed with makeshift rafts or half-submerged fords. Dense woods slow progress, and at night the damp chill seeps through woolen cloaks, carrying with it fevers and coughs. Disease spreads quietly among them, dysentery, lice infestations and exhaustion weakening those who have no shelter beyond the open sky. Peter the Hermit moves among them, praying and encouraging, yet unable to alleviate the most basic dangers. Still the marchers continue, driven by hope, devotion or desperation, the reasons indistinguishable to the observer, yet entirely personal to each participant. The psychological landscape of the march is as severe as the physical. Many pilgrims experience visions and dreams, some inspired by religious ecstasy, others by fever or exhaustion. These visions reinforce the idea of divine favor and the promise of salvation, yet they can also deepen confusion. Stories emerge of crosses appearing in the sky, angels guiding the weary through forests, and miraculous rivers of water appearing for those on the brink of collapse. The mixture of hope, fear, and devotion creates a surreal atmosphere, as though the march is moving through a world suspended between earth and heaven, between tangible suffering and spiritual vision. Violence is never far behind. As the column moves through Hungary, the local population, fearful of such a vast untrained mass, initially welcomes them, offering provisions. Yet cultural misunderstanding, petty theft, and the uncontrolled behavior of some followers provoke clashes. Chroniclers recount skirmishes with locals and opportunistic raiders. In some accounts, these confrontations escalate, leading to injury and death, underscoring the vulnerability of the movement. These early conflicts foreshadow the greater struggles to come in Anatolia and the Levant, revealing the fragile nature of devotion untempered by discipline or military training. Despite these hardships, the march also fosters solidarity. Shared suffering binds the group together. Fathers care for children, women support each other across the mud, and strangers share what little they have. Stories and songs pass along the line of travelers, carrying lessons, warnings, and prayers. Each night, fires are lit in open fields, casting long shadows across the faces of the exhausted yet hopeful marchers. The smell of burning wood mingles with the earthy scent of damp soil and sweat, forming a constant sensory reminder of the arduous journey they have undertaken. The Red Cross glows faintly in the firelight, a symbol of shared purpose amid chaos. The pace is slow but relentless. Some groups march faster, driven by youthful energy or impatience. Others lag behind, weakened by hunger or illness. In many cases, small detachments break off to gather supplies, find shelter, or follow visions of holy guidance. These splits sometimes lead to tragedy, individuals or families lost in forests, rivers, or to opportunistic bandits. Yet the overarching force of the march endures, propelled by the magnetic figure of Peter the Hermit and by the shared vision of Jerusalem, a city at once distant, sacred, and imagined in vivid detail. Months pass as the column winds its way across Europe, crossing rivers, fording marshes, and climbing low hills. Chroniclers note the endurance of ordinary people performing feats that would otherwise seem impossible, walking hundreds of kilometers without proper footwear, surviving weeks with minimal provisions, enduring storms and wind, yet continuing to sing psalms and offer prayers. Their suffering is both physical and spiritual, but it is sanctified in their own eyes, a living act of devotion that transforms exhaustion into purpose, fear into hope, and hunger into spiritual endurance. The marchers finally reach the borders of Hungary and the Byzantine territories. Here the untrained multitude encounters organized military forces for the first time. The Byzantine authorities, unfamiliar with the magnitude and disorder of this human tide, offer both aid and caution. Provisions are limited, guidance sparse, and the cultural and linguistic barriers pose continual challenges. Nevertheless, the marchers press onward, driven by their singular vision of Jerusalem, unbowed by distance, exhaustion, or the shadow of doubt. Their journey, though tragic in human cost, lays the foundation for the more organized crusading armies to follow, demonstrating the first spark of collective movement toward the Holy Land, a spark that will ignite the campaigns of the nobility in the months to come. Through hunger, confusion, and massacre, the People's Crusade presses eastward. Each step carves a path across Europe that will be remembered in chronicles, not for strategy or victory, but for the sheer devotion of those who believe themselves instruments of divine will. Their suffering, their hope, and their flawed courage set the stage for what is to come. The great armies of the lords, disciplined, armed, and bound by oath, moving toward a destiny that will intertwine faith, war, and history in ways no one yet comprehends. And in this way, the roads of Europe become not merely highways, but the first arteries of a movement that will reshape Christendom, flowing inexorably toward lands unseen yet vividly imagined, toward Jerusalem, toward fate. As the spring of 1096 deepens into early summer, Europe hums with preparation, while the peasants march chaotically under the guidance of Peter the Hermit. Another movement rises simultaneously, but with a different rhythm and purpose. Here the air is not thick with dust and desperation, but with deliberation and planning. Castles and fortified towns across France, Burgundy, and Italy awaken with a new urgency. Scribes draft letters, armorers repair mail, blacksmiths forge swords, and merchants calculate provisions in anticipation of a journey unlike any undertaken before. Nobles across the continent take the Pope's call seriously, but they do so with foresight, seeking to convert the spiritual summons into military precision. Among the first to heed the call are men whose names will echo through history. Godfrey of Bouillon, a warrior of both repute and discipline, surveys his estates, counting retainers and preparing to leave his holdings under trusted care. He is a man of measured temperament, devout yet aware of political realities, understanding that a crusade will demand not only courage but careful coordination. To the east, Raymond IV of Toulouse marshals a force drawn from Occitania, his lands a mosaic of loyal knights, vassals and mercenaries. His banners are embroidered with crimson and gold, bearing symbols of both piety and territorial pride. In southern Italy, Bohemond of Taranto prepares a contingent shaped by years of military experience in Sicily, bringing soldiers skilled in both siegecraft and cavalry maneuvers. Each noble operates within his own world of hierarchy and obligation, yet all are united by the spiritual imperative issued at Clermont. Preparation is painstaking. Estates are meticulously inventoried, food stores collected and rationed, horses selected and trained for endurance. Chroniclers note that even minor lords sell parts of their estates to finance the expedition, converting property into gold, grain, and arms. The clergy bless every endeavor, offering indulgences, prayers, and relics to protect the travelers on the road ahead. Chaplains are attached to each retinue, carrying relics of saints and crosses of red cloth, ensuring that religious observance accompanies every measure of martial readiness. The Red Cross, once a symbol pinned crudely to the peasants' tunics, now becomes the emblem of organized crusading forces, a mark of devotion fused with disciplined strategy. As the nobles gather their banners, the contrast with the People's Crusade becomes evident. Where Peter the Hermit's followers stumble and falter in chaos, these armies move with deliberate intent. Knights practice formations, squires polish armor, and captains drill men in the handling of pike and shield. Supplies are stored in wagons and carts, carefully balanced to ensure mobility across forests, rivers, and plains. Horses are loaded with packs of grain and fodder, alongside spare weapons, tents, and iron tools for the anticipated sieges. In towns along the route, the departure of such contingents is celebrated with solemn ceremony. Bells toll, masses are held, and banners are blessed before the first steps are taken. The sheer scale of mobilization is staggering. Chroniclers describe columns stretching for kilometers, a moving tapestry of banners, pennants, and armored men. Each noble's retinue carries its own identity: the fleur-de-lis of northern France, the son of Toulouse, the lion of Bouillon, yet all share the same vision of moving toward the east. Clerics interpret the simultaneous emergence of these forces as a sign of divine orchestration, while secular observers marvel at the coordination required to gather men, horses, and provisions from lands separated by rivers, forests, and mountains. The banners rise, fluttering in the wind, a dawn of order over the chaos that preceded it. Recruitment extends beyond the nobility. Knights without lands, eager for adventure or spiritual redemption, join the banners in droves. In some regions, entire contingents are drawn from towns and villages where local lords lend their influence. Chroniclers record that men of various social strata march together under a single banner, their collective identity defined by the cross on their shoulder, rather than by birthright alone. It is a convergence of ambition and piety, strategy and faith, forming armies that will soon traverse continents and confront challenges no European has yet faced. As preparations continue, roads begin to echo with the sound of movement. Horses clip-clop over cobblestones, armor jingles with each step, and trumpets sound their warnings at dawn. Each day is calculated: days for riding, days for rest, days for mass and prayer. Nobles instruct their captains to maintain discipline, to respect local populations, and to enforce the oaths taken under the gaze of God. Yet even in this structured march, uncertainty lurks. The journey to Constantinople will pass through lands unfamiliar. with potential for conflict both from nature and from men, and the memory of the People's Crusade hangs as a cautionary shadow. Beyond the logistical and martial preparations, there is a quiet spiritual dimension. Every morning begins with Mass. Every night ends with prayer. Chaplains recite the Gospels. Knights kneel in reflection upon the mystery of Christ's suffering. The red cross pinned to armor is both emblem and talisman, reminding each participant that the ultimate goal is not conquest, but devotion, that every battle fought is framed as an act of divine will. This intertwining of strategy and spirituality gives the crusade a singular character, a movement both temporal and eternal, earthly and sacred. When at last the first banners depart from the castles and manors of France, Burgundy and southern Italy, the visual impact is overwhelming. Miles of men and horses, wagons and standard-bearers, wind through valleys, ford rivers, and ascend hillsides, each group following its chosen path toward rendezvous points in the Danube Valley or across the Alps. Local populations gather along the roads to offer blessings, supplies, or prayers, aware that these armies are leaving behind more than lands. They are leaving behind a Europe transformed by the call of the Pope. In this moment, the crusading armies stand as an organized echo of the chaos that came before. The Red Cross, which had begun as a small emblem of devotion pinned to a peasant tunic, now waves atop banners and shields, carried by disciplined men, trained in arms and bound by oaths. The orders, the hierarchy, and the solemnity of departure create a contrast to the improvised People's Crusade, yet both are propelled by the same force. The vision of Jerusalem, sacred and distant, calling from beyond the horizon. Thus Europe begins to move as one, not in homogeneity, but in coordinated purpose. The peasants have taken the first steps, sowing the idea of crusade across the countryside, while the lords now marshal strength capable of confronting distant armies. Together their movements converge into a broader momentum, building inexorably toward the east, where rivers, mountains, and empires await. And so, from the rising banners and the disciplined marches of the nobility, the stage is set for the next phase of the journey, a passage across unfamiliar lands toward the Byzantine Empire, where allies and unforeseen challenges await. By late summer of 1096, the great armies of the lords reach the eastern edges of Europe, where the contours of rivers and hills give way to the sparkling expanse of the Bosporus. From a distance, the city of Constantinople emerges like a jewel, perched between the waters of the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara. Its domes gleam in the sun, mosaics glitter in the reflection of rivers, and walls rise in layered grandeur that seems to defy both time and gravity. The air is thick with the scent of the sea, mingling with the smoke of countless hearths, the brine of merchant vessels, and the faint perfume of incense wafting from basilicas. For the first time, the Crusaders witness the majesty of Byzantium, a city alive with commerce, ceremony, and faith. The arrival of these vast armies is both a marvel and a source of tension for Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. He stands upon the ramparts of the city, tall and composed, a figure of intellect and experience, aware that the armies approaching from the west could either be the salvation of his lands or the prelude to chaos. The Seljuk Turks have threatened his territories for decades, and the Byzantine Empire is cautious, weakened by years of internal strife and frontier losses. Yet Alexios recognizes the opportunity. If he can harness the enthusiasm and numbers of the Western Knights, he may recover lands lost in Asia Minor and fortify the empire's eastern borders. Still, his welcome is measured. He does not mistake devotion for discipline. He sees both the threat and potential within these columns of men, all bearing the Red Cross, all proclaiming the will of God as their guide. The Crusaders themselves are awed and unsettled. The splendor of Constantinople is unlike anything they have encountered in Europe. Markets teem with goods from across the Mediterranean and Asia, silks from Antioch, spices from Alexandria, glasswork from Venice, and coins stamped with images of emperors long thought distant and legendary. Horse-drawn carts trundle through streets paved with stone. The voices of merchants, sailors, and soldiers mingle in a symphony of languages. Temples and churches rise beside imperial palaces, their mosaics depicting saints and emperors in colors that seem to capture sunlight itself. For many knights, accustomed to mud, forests and stone castles of northern France or southern Italy, the city is a vision of civilization both alien and intoxicating. Formalities are observed, yet the interaction between Byzantines and Crusaders is fraught with subtle tension. Alexios requests that each noble swear an oath of loyalty, that any former Byzantine lands retaken by the Crusaders will be returned to imperial control. To some, this seems a reasonable stipulation. To others, it is an unfamiliar constraint, a puzzle wrapped in diplomacy and hierarchy. The lords, proud of their martial independence, agree outwardly, though the meaning of these oaths is only partly grasped. They pledge themselves with words, bow before the emperor, and promise fidelity, all the while conceiving plans for conquest that are theirs alone. The negotiation is delicate. Faith and pragmatism mingle, ceremonial bows mask suspicion, and mutual need guides every gesture. The Byzantine court provides provisions, ships and guides. Ships are ready to carry men, horses and supplies across the narrow waters separating Europe from Asia Minor. Engineers and quartermasters coordinate the logistics, detailing how wagons will be ferried, how troops will disembark, and how supplies will be rationed. Horses are led aboard vessels in carefully choreographed operations, and the Crusaders marvel at the size and sophistication of the Byzantine fleet. Chroniclers describe the scene as both wondrous and frightening. The sheer scale of preparation highlights the distances and dangers yet to come, while the glittering harbor suggests a civilization infinitely more advanced than the villages and castles left behind. Despite this order, anxiety pulses through the ranks. Many knights have never crossed open water with their horses. Few understand the exact geography of Asia Minor, the strength of its rulers, or the climate that awaits. Chroniclers recount whispered fears among the troops, rumors of ambushes, of poisoned wells, of desert lands that will test every ounce of endurance. Yet these fears coexist with anticipation, the promise of fighting for God, the glory of reclaiming Jerusalem, the hope of indulgence and salvation. Each knight balances courage and caution, ambition and devotion, as the day of embarkation approaches. The crossing itself is a mixture of ceremony and labor. Men march aboard ships, banners trailing, armor clinking, psalms rising above the sound of water against hull. Horses, nervous and unaccustomed to the sway of vessels, are coaxed with feed and gentle prods. Officers supervise the stowing of provisions, dried meats, grains, wine, and water sufficient for weeks of travel. Priests move among the soldiers, blessing the journey, sprinkling holy water upon the decks, and invoking God's protection over every man and beast. The currents of the Bosporus tug at the vessels, and the sight of Constantinople shrinking behind them is both thrilling and sobering. The city's splendor remains imprinted on memory even as the land of the known recedes into distance. Once across, the armies confront Asia Minor in earnest. The landscape changes. Fertile plains give way to rocky hills, river valleys to forests of oak and pine, and distant mountains rise like sentinels against the horizon. The heat is harsher, the winds more insistent, and the soil drier. Chroniclers note the discomforts of men unaccustomed to such climate, sunburn, fatigue, and the relentless hunger that accompanies the first weeks of the march. Scouts ride ahead, searching for safe passages, and guides provided by the Byzantines warn of Seljuk forces, nomadic raids, and narrow defiles. The road ahead is as perilous as it is promising. In these early days beyond the Bosporus, the unity of the crusading armies is tested. Different lords have varying priorities. Some wish to press quickly toward Nicaea and Antioch. Others prefer to consolidate their forces and fortify supply lines. Tensions emerge between French, Norman, and Italian contingents, not violent yet persistent, subtle disagreements over routes, lodgings, and leadership. Yet beneath these disputes lies a shared understanding of purpose. The pilgrimage of the cross now carries with it the weight of oaths, expectations, and divine sanction. The armies move cautiously but deliberately, learning to coordinate movements across unfamiliar terrain. drawing upon the lessons of Byzantine logistics, even as their own martial culture asserts authority. Thus, the crossing of the Bosporus marks more than a geographic transition. It is a passage into a new reality. Europe's nobles, having left their lands and families, now enter a space where survival, faith, and strategy intertwine. Constantinople fades behind them like a vision, a memory of wealth and ceremony, while the terrain of Asia Minor looms ahead, uncharted in experience if not in rumor. In the currents of rivers and seas, in the shimmer of distant mountains and forests, they sense both promise and peril, a world that will test courage, endurance, and devotion to limits unknown. The armies advance slowly from the landing points, aware that the empire they traverse is neither empty nor entirely friendly. Guides lead them along secure roads, while Byzantine authorities warn of potential dangers. Every river ford, forested ridge, and mountain pass carries both opportunity and threat. Yet the momentum of the crusade is irresistible. Noble vows, red crosses, and centuries of faith combine to propel thousands of men into lands that will soon be the stage for sieges, battles, and history itself. It is here, crossing the threshold from familiar Europe into Asia Minor, that the Crusaders' journey assumes the weight and texture of legend, carrying them inexorably toward Nicaea, Antioch, and ultimately Jerusalem. Once the armies of the First Crusade had crossed the Bosporus, they entered a landscape, both foreign and formidable, a land that would test endurance, faith, and patience beyond anything the men of Europe had known. Asia Minor stretched before them as an expanse of dry plains, rolling hills, and jagged ridges, broken only by river valleys and the occasional walled city that stood like a sentinel of forgotten empires. The sunlight fell relentlessly, reflected by the stone and dust, and every morning brought the challenge of heat and fatigue. Armor, once heavy but protective, now became a burden, glinting harshly in the unshielded sun, trapping sweat and weight upon the knight's shoulders. Soldiers accustomed to the temperate fields of France or the forested hills of Burgundy found the landscape unforgiving. Their skin blistered, lips cracked, and water became as precious as gold. The roads themselves were little more than tracks between villages, sometimes winding along ridges, sometimes cutting through valleys over rocky terrain. Wagon wheels sank into dust or mud, depending on the season, and the cries of oxen pulling supplies echoed across the empty stretches of Anatolia. Guides supplied by the Byzantines attempted to point the safest routes, but the Crusaders were slow to learn the land. Scouts riding ahead often returned with alarming news: distant cities abandoned or sacked, water sources distant or depleted, and reports of Turkish raiders observing the columns from the hills. These observations were often correct. Ambushes occurred with terrifying frequency, and small detachments were scattered or cut down before reinforcements could arrive. Yet it was not only human threat that tested the Crusaders. The climate, with its sudden storms and harsh midday sun, left many weakened, faint, or delirious. Chroniclers recount men fainting in fields, children suffering from fever, and pack animals collapsing under heat and overexertion. Dust choked the lungs of those who marched, mingling with the scent of sweat and the odor of manure from the animals. At night, temperatures plummeted, leaving the unprepared shivering under thin blankets or woolen cloaks, the faint glow of fires casting elongated shadows across the terrain. Hunger gnawed persistently, though supply wagons followed. Food often spoiled in the heat, water sources were scarce, and foraging sometimes led to skirmishes with local populations. As the Crusaders advanced, they passed through the remnants of cities and towns, many abandoned or partially destroyed in the previous decades of conflict between Byzantines and Seljuk Turks. Stone walls stood half-ruined, streets strewn with debris, and the silence of these ghost towns struck heavily upon the travelers' hearts. Where once bustling markets had sold spices, grains, and cloth, only wind stirred among broken stalls. The absence of life amplified the eerie sense that they were moving through lands haunted by memory and war. For some soldiers, the emptiness became oppressive. For others, it was a reminder of purpose, that the Holy Land itself awaited, and that divine providence had called them to endure. Conflict, though intermittent, was relentless. Turkish forces employed tactics unfamiliar to the Europeans, small, fast-moving cavalry, archers who struck from distance, and ambushes in the narrow passes between hills. Sieges were not yet the focus, but harassment and raids were constant. Chroniclers describe the fear that gripped the untrained, especially among the contingents led by Peter the Hermit, or those less disciplined than the knights of Bouillon, Raymond, and Bohemond. In these moments, prayer and ritual became vital. Soldiers would kneel in exhausted fatigue, reciting psalms and begging for protection, clutching crosses as if they could shield them from arrows or steel. The red emblem on their shoulder or shield became more than symbol. It was talisman, hope, and promise. Despite the hardships, the march through Anatolia forged a collective resilience. The nobles enforced discipline among their retinues, ensuring that stragglers were gathered, scouts reported consistently, and supply lines remained functional. The shared suffering, though immense, strengthened bonds between knights and men-at-arms, while chaplains and priests worked tirelessly to maintain spiritual morale. Every step taken, every river crossed, every ridge climbed, was interpreted as an act of devotion, a physical manifestation of faith that transcended the discomfort and danger surrounding them. Chroniclers later emphasized that these early days, though unremarkable in grand narrative terms, were essential in hardening the men for the trials that awaited in the sieges and battles of the Levant. The geography of Asia Minor presented not only challenges of survival but also of navigation and strategy. Rivers such as the Sangarios and the Haulis could not always be forded easily. Mountains like the Anatolian ranges presented formidable obstacles, and plains stretched for days without visible shelter or water. The Crusaders relied heavily upon Byzantine maps, guides, and local knowledge, yet communication gaps and differing priorities caused delays. The need for rest and sustenance often dictated the pace, slowing the armies and giving Turkish scouts opportunities to observe and strike. Still, the determination of the leaders kept the column moving steadily toward Nicaea, the first major city on the path to Jerusalem. The emotional landscape mirrored the physical. Men grew weary, but also more pious in their rituals. Campsites were marked by the chanting of prayers, the lighting of fires at dusk, and the blessing of supplies each morning. The cross, stitched to surcoats and hung from tents, reminded them of the purpose behind every hardship. Songs and stories of holy intervention spread among the soldiers, offering comfort and courage, while chronicles record that some men experienced visions, dreams of angels guiding them, or of Jerusalem shining in distant sunlight, that renewed their determination when human exhaustion threatened to overcome them. Yet alongside faith and hope, anxiety and fear persisted. Every distant hill could conceal an enemy. Every abandoned town could hide traps. Disease, hunger, and thirst claimed lives silently, leaving bodies by the roadside or in shallow graves hastily dug by companions. Chroniclers recount the constant presence of death, and the silence that fell upon encampments at night, broken only by murmured prayers and the creaking of wagons. The experience was both communal and intensely personal. Each man confronted his mortality while pursuing a goal larger than himself, his suffering imbued with spiritual significance. Through weeks of arduous travel, the Crusaders slowly approached Nicaea, a city of significance both strategic and symbolic. Their passage through Anatolia has shaped the men, tested their endurance, and demonstrated the vast challenges of moving untrained armies across hostile territory. The sun-baked hills, the dry plains, the shadowed valleys, and the abandoned cities have left an imprint upon the travelers' minds, blending memory, fear, and hope into a single continuous experience. The first taste of real confrontation with enemy forces lies ahead, but the journey itself has already transformed the Crusaders, preparing them for the sieges and battles that will define the campaign. Thus, the long road through Anatolia is more than movement across geography. It is the forging of men and purpose under trial, the intertwining of faith, endurance, and strategy, and the prelude to the monumental siege that awaits at Nicaea. Every mile traveled, every hardship endured, carries the armies inexorably forward toward a city whose walls will challenge both strength and devotion, and toward the horizon where the vision of Jerusalem awaits in the distance. burning ever brighter in their collective imagination. After weeks of relentless march through the harsh terrain of Anatolia, the Crusader armies finally arrived before the walls of Nicaea, the first major objective of the First Crusade. Situated along the eastern shore of Lake Ascanius, the city rose with a grandeur that belied its recent occupation by the Seljuk Turks. Its massive walls, reinforced with towers at regular intervals, overlooked fertile plains and offered a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. The lake itself formed a natural barrier, and the Seljuks, seasoned in defense and familiar with the terrain, had fortified every approach. The air was dry and hot, carrying the faint smell of the city and of the livestock within its walls, mingled with the dust of the advancing Crusaders. Here the long training of the march would be tested against both human ingenuity and the endurance of men unaccustomed to prolonged siege. The Crusaders approached with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Banners fluttered in the morning breeze, reflecting the sun over armor polished during weeks of march. Commanders, including Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse, organized their troops with care, aware that coordination and strategy were vital against a fortified city. Horses were rested at designated points, wagons arranged for supply and mobility, and camps fortified with earthworks and palisades. Though the soldiers carried the fervor of pilgrimage and the zeal of holy crusaders, they were learning the nuances of patience and the slow grind of siege warfare. Lessons unfamiliar to many who had never faced walls of stone so imposing, nor defenders so resourceful. The Seljuks within Nicaea were equally determined. Commanded by Kilij Arslan, who had recently defeated the earlier waves of crusaders led by Peter the Hermit, the defenders employed a combination of cunning and practical defense. They repaired walls, manned towers, and patrolled battlements, observing the approaching crusaders while sending out small raiding parties to harass foraging groups. Water supplies were carefully guarded, food rationed, and morale maintained through strict discipline. The city's strategic position near Lake Ascanius allowed the defenders to resist long enough to await potential reinforcements from other Anatolian holdings, or to negotiate terms favorable to themselves. It was a confrontation not only of force but of patience, intelligence, and will. Negotiations and subtle diplomacy interwove with the siege. Emperor Alexios I, whose cautious wisdom had guided the arrival of the Crusaders, maintained contact with both sides. While the Crusaders believed themselves acting independently in service of God, Alexios sought to secure Nicaea under Byzantine control, aiming to recover territory lost to the Seljuks without bloodshed where possible. Byzantine agents communicated with the defenders, promising terms that might facilitate surrender while simultaneously assuring the Crusaders that they would not be cheated of the spiritual and martial purpose of their endeavor. The balance was delicate, as each party sought advantage, yet all were bound by a shared understanding that open confrontation would be costly, time-consuming, and potentially perilous. The Crusaders' initial assaults were cautious, probing the city's defenses while establishing positions for larger engines of siege. Towers of wood were constructed, simple catapults assembled, and scouting parties explored weaknesses in the walls. Patience became a virtue. The armies, vast though they were, could not overwhelm Nicaea by force alone. Discipline and coordination were tested daily. Officers reminded soldiers to maintain order, to ration supplies, and to keep morale intact. Chaplains moved among the ranks, reminding men that spiritual endurance paralleled physical effort, that each day spent before the walls was itself an act of devotion, and that the slow, measured approach was both necessary and sanctified. After weeks of preparation, siege works, and negotiation, the culmination of Alexios's careful orchestration unfolded. Under cover of night and secrecy, Byzantine forces coordinated with elements within Nicaea to facilitate surrender. The gates opened to Byzantine troops rather than to the Crusaders themselves. In the morning, the banners of Alexios were raised atop the walls, signaling the city's return to Byzantine control. The Crusaders, witnessing this, experienced a mixture of triumph and unease. They had contributed through blockade, patience and readiness, yet the final moment of conquest had occurred under another's authority. Chroniclers note that for some, this uneasy victory was a source of mild frustration; for others it reinforced the delicate interplay between martial action and divine providence. The city itself, now under Byzantine authority, bore the marks of both neglect and conflict. Streets were cleared, defensive towers repaired, and provisions redistributed. Refugees from surrounding areas sought shelter within Nicaea, bringing news of other regions, of local populations under duress, and of further strategic opportunities. For the Crusaders, the siege provided lessons in organization, logistics, and the subtleties of diplomacy, alongside direct combat. They had learned that warfare, even when sanctified by faith, required patience, cooperation, and adaptation, lessons that would be vital as they advanced deeper into Anatolia and toward Antioch and Jerusalem. Moreover, the siege demonstrated the complexity of alliances. The Crusaders' religious fervor, though immense, had to be harmonized with the political objectives of Byzantium. Alexios had secured the city with minimal bloodshed, preserved the empire's territorial integrity, and subtly reminded the Western Knights that while divine sanction empowered them, earthly authority required prudence. For the Crusaders, this was a tangible lesson. Their journey was shaped not only by faith and ambition, but also by the delicate negotiations, hierarchies, and subtleties of the lands they traversed. As the armies prepared to depart Nicaea and continue their march deeper into Anatolia, they carried with them both the confidence of achievement and the awareness of further challenges ahead. The city's capture was a milestone, yet the journey to Jerusalem remained distant and arduous. Their experiences at Nicaea, the long days of watch, the construction of siege engines, the negotiations with both the enemy and their Byzantine allies, had instilled a new dimension of discipline, humility, and strategic understanding. The march would continue, but the soldiers had learned that even victories sanctified by faith could come tempered with uncertainty and the hand of others' authority. Thus, the siege of Nicaea stands as both a beginning and a lesson. It marks the transition from marching armies confronting natural obstacles to disciplined forces, confronting fortified cities and political complexities. It demonstrates that devotion alone is not enough. Endurance, strategy, and cooperation are equally necessary. And while the city now bears the Byzantine banner, the Crusaders carry forward the knowledge, experience, and determination that will sustain them through the trials yet to come, as they move toward Dorylaeum, Antioch, and the ultimate vision of Jerusalem that has inspired this vast undertaking from the moment of Clermont. After the tentative triumph at Nicaea, the Crusader armies pressed onward, heading southward through the scorched plains and broken ridges of Anatolia. The city, while a symbol of a first hard-won victory, was now behind them, and the land ahead offered no such relief. The summer sun rose relentlessly, casting its harsh glare upon the travelers and their animals, turning dirt into powder that rose in clouds with every step. The wind carried the smell of parched earth and dried grass, mingling with the odor of sweat, leather, and unwashed bodies. Men's eyes watered constantly from dust and exhaustion, while armor clung oppressively to their skin, providing little comfort against the heat. Every mile stretched like a lifetime, and the horizon seemed unending, a desert of stone, scrub, and the occasional shadow of a distant hill. Water became the most precious commodity. Streams were rare, and wells were often brackish or guarded by wary locals. Men and animals alike suffered. Lips cracked, tongues parched, and lips swelled in the sun. Soldiers rationed every drop, sharing sparingly with horses, yet sometimes both humans and beasts collapsed along the way. Chroniclers later emphasized the physical strain, noting men fainting in the heat, children clinging to mothers, and oxen unable to pull laden wagons further. Camps were chosen not for strategic advantage, but for proximity to water or shade, yet shade was scarce, and shade that existed was already crowded with fellow travelers. Even prayers were difficult to vocalize under the oppressive sun, yet men persisted, kneeling whenever possible, murmuring psalms as beads of sweat ran down their foreheads. Hunger, too, gnawed steadily. Supplies from Nicaea were finite, and the roads offered few opportunities to replenish. Foraging sometimes led to confrontation with locals, resulting in small skirmishes that claimed the lives of men and livestock. Dry bread, salted meat, and occasional fruits became the main sustenance. The diet, monotonous and insufficient, exacerbated the fatigue of march. Horses weakened from overwork and lack of fodder slowed columns, and wagons bogged in sandy soil became a persistent challenge. Each day demanded not only physical endurance but ingenuity, patience and collective coordination to maintain the progress of the armies. The terrain itself imposed constant trials. The Anatolian plateau alternated between stony ridges, valleys of dust and scrub, and patches of low forest that offered brief respite but also concealed danger. Small rivers were crossed using makeshift rafts or by carefully leading horses through shallow fords. Hillsides forced columns to stretch thin, leaving men vulnerable to sudden attacks or surprise raids. The Seljuk Turks, adept at cavalry and archery, observed and harried the Crusaders at opportune moments. Ambushes in narrow passes were particularly feared, horsemen striking from a distance with composite bows, then retreating before the Crusaders could respond. Though these encounters were rarely decisive, they inflicted casualties, delayed progress, and imposed a psychological toll, reminding the knights that the land itself had its own perils. Morale fluctuated with each hardship. Soldiers prayed fervently, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently, interpreting each breeze, each cloud, each obstacle as a sign of divine will. Chaplains moved through columns, blessing men and animals, sprinkling holy water over supplies, and reminding the faithful that endurance in suffering was a form of devotion. Songs and hymns filled camps at night, offering both solace and the reinforcement of shared purpose. Tales of miraculous escapes or heavenly signs traveled rapidly among the men, giving courage to those whose strength faltered. Yet despair was never far. Bodies fell by the roadside from exhaustion or disease, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the dust that clung to every surface. In addition to physical suffering, the march presented logistical challenges of immense complexity. Columns of knights, infantry and wagon trains extended for miles, necessitating careful coordination to avoid bottlenecks, confusion and accidents. Scouts reconnoitered ahead for water, grazing land and signs of enemy forces. Officers relayed orders with flags, messengers or mounted couriers, yet delays and misunderstandings were inevitable. The soundscape of the march was a constant mixture of clattering armor, creaking wheels, distant shouting, and the wind itself, blowing dust into eyes and ears alike. The slow rhythm of progress imposed a mental strain as much as a physical one, with each day measured in fatigue, thirst, and the hope that the horizon might finally reveal shelter, stream or town. Despite these hardships, camaraderie persisted. Knights tended the sick and wounded, sharing what little food or water they had. Priests consoled families, offering prayers and absolution, while minor nobles and captains enforced discipline to prevent panic or desertion. Soldiers learned to support one another, guiding the weak, encouraging the fearful, and distributing labor evenly. The red cross sewn onto surcoats or painted upon shields became more than a symbol of faith. It became a beacon of shared endurance, a reminder that suffering was both collective and sanctified. Even those who had doubted their purpose or feared for their lives found reinforcement in the presence of companions, in the shared rhythm of marching, in the collective determination that bound them to the vision of Jerusalem. At night, when the heat of the day subsided only slightly, camps were raised in temporary clearings, sometimes near small springs, sometimes beside abandoned villages. Fires were lit sparingly to conserve resources, and men slept fitfully under the stars, listening to distant wolves, the cries of watchmen, and the whisper of wind across dry grass. The constellations became familiar guides, marking the passage of time and the movement southward. Soldiers whispered stories of Jerusalem, imagining its walls, its markets, and its sacred sites, a mental sustenance as vital as bread or water. Dreams mingled with exhaustion, with visions of triumph, divine favor, or the mercy of God interlaced with fears of death, ambush, or permanent failure. Through this relentless journey, the Crusaders were transformed. Bodies hardened, spirits sharpened, and leadership tested. Every hill climbed, every river crossed, every day endured in heat and dust reinforced both the physical and spiritual dimensions of the expedition. The reality of the march made clear that the dream of Jerusalem was neither immediate nor easily attained. It required fortitude, patience, and an unwavering sense of purpose in the face of trials that seemed to stretch endlessly across the Anatolian landscape. The march itself became a crucible, forging not only soldiers but believers whose devotion was tempered by hardship. And so, as the armies neared the approaches of Dorylaeum, the sun-baked plains and rocky ridges behind them bore witness to the immense cost of movement through a hostile and unfamiliar land. Men collapsed from heat, horses faltered under the weight of equipment, and thirst remained an omnipresent companion. Yet the vision of Jerusalem persisted, flickering in minds and hearts like a distant, unyielding flame. Every hardship endured, every mile crossed, was a step toward fulfillment of the promise that had begun at Clermont, a promise of sacred purpose, of redemption, and of the distant radiant city that awaited beyond the fire and dust of Anatolia. By mid-July of 1097, the Crusader armies had advanced through the sweltering plains and broken ridges of Anatolia, their bodies hardened by dust, heat, and relentless movement. The long, grueling march had tested the limits of endurance, discipline, and faith, yet it also shaped a unity among disparate groups of knights, infantry, and pilgrims. Now near the town of Dorylaeum, this unity would be tested in a confrontation that would become a defining moment of the First Crusade. The plains stretched before them, shimmering under the fierce Anatolian sun, while distant hills traced the horizon in a mirage-like haze, suggesting both possibility and danger. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, heavy with heat and the faint scent of parched grass and horses, mingling with the metallic tang of blood yet to be shed. The enemy, the Seljuk Turks under Kilij Arslan, was prepared. Having observed the Crusader columns advancing from Nicaea, they understood the value of striking decisively at the rear of the army before it could consolidate its strength. Light cavalry, archers and horse archers formed the core of their tactics, designed to harass, confuse, and exhaust the heavier, less mobile European forces. Their strategy relied upon mobility, knowledge of terrain, and the psychological impact of sudden, relentless assaults, arrows that rained from a distance, the thunder of hooves, and the rapid retreat to concealment before a counterattack could be mounted. To the Crusaders, these tactics initially appeared chaotic and bewildering, as the Turkish horsemen seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish as quickly, leaving trails of anxiety and fear. The Crusaders, for their part, had learned patience and endurance during the march. Commanders such as Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse coordinated their divisions with deliberate care. The army formed into a defensive structure, with infantry protecting flanks, cavalry held in reserve for counterattacks, and scouts positioned to anticipate ambushes. Men-at-arms, their armor now darkened with dust and sweat, gripped shields and spears with a rhythm forged over days of marching and hardship. The red crosses on surcoats and banners served both as rallying points and as reminders of the divine purpose behind their struggle. In the tension before engagement, there was a collective awareness that this battle was both a test of martial skill and of spiritual resolve. The attack began in waves. Turkish archers advanced in rapid, fluid motions, striking with arrows from a distance and retreating before the Crusaders could effectively respond. Cavalry charges disrupted supply lines, targeting stragglers and attempting to isolate smaller contingents. The first hours of engagement were chaotic. Dust rose in clouds, obscuring vision. The clash of steel rang intermittently. Cries of pain and exhortation mingled with the shouts of officers attempting to maintain order. Many Crusaders, still learning the tactical nuances of open-field engagement against mobile horsemen, felt disoriented and fatigued, yet the discipline instilled during the march allowed them to hold ranks, protect weaker men, and prevent complete collapse. At the heart of the engagement, the cohesion of the crusade began to assert itself. Where individual contingents might otherwise have fled or fractured under the barrage of arrows, the nobles coordinated reinforcements, directing cavalry to flank and stabilize threatened sections. Infantry formed protective formations around wagons, wounded men, and key leaders. Chaplains moved along the lines, blessing men and reminding them that their endurance and courage were acts of devotion. The juxtaposition of physical exertion, strategy, and faith became tangible. Each act of resistance, each steadfast hold of position was both a tactical necessity and a spiritual commitment. Chroniclers later noted that these moments forged a unity among knights and infantry who had been strangers mere weeks before, knitting together a sense of shared purpose essential for the campaigns to come. The battle stretched for hours, with intermittent lulls where the sun bore down mercilessly and dust choked men and horses alike. The Crusaders adapted to the Seljuk tactics. Archers were shielded, cavalry moved in disciplined formations to counter flanking, and messengers relayed rapid commands. Small victories within the engagement, the successful holding of a hilltop, the routing of a raiding party, the reinforcement of a vulnerable flank, provided psychological sustenance, each raising confidence and reinforcing the collective identity of the army. Despite exhaustion, thirst, and wounds, the soldiers pressed forward, step by step, formation by formation, their perseverance becoming as significant as the weapons they wielded. As afternoon passed into evening, the balance began to shift. The Crusaders' heavier armor, disciplined formations, and coordinated counterattacks gradually wore down the Turkish assaults. The mobility of the Seljuk horse archers, so effective against scattered or fatigued units, could no longer exploit gaps that had been closed and reinforced. Leadership and endurance, combined with the slow, deliberate application of force, allowed the Crusaders to stabilize lines and begin to push back against the enemy. Arrows continued to fly, but the intensity diminished as Turkish forces retreated to avoid further losses and regroup. Dust hung in the air, mingling with the scent of blood and sweat, creating an almost tangible record of exertion and trial. By nightfall, the field was scattered with the remnants of conflict. Bodies of men and horses lay across the plains, a testament to both suffering and survival. The Crusaders had endured, learned, and adapted. Their cohesion had been tested and strengthened, while not a complete annihilation of the enemy. The Battle of Dorylaeum marked a decisive tactical victory, opening the road toward Antioch and beyond. The Seljuk forces faded toward the horizon, leaving the Crusaders both victorious and wary, aware that future encounters would be no less challenging, yet confident in their collective capacity to meet adversity. In the aftermath, the Crusaders attended to the wounded, tended their animals, and regrouped under the fading light of the Anatolian sun. The unity forged on this day would prove essential in the sieges and marches to come. Men reflected silently on the experience, the combination of physical endurance, strategic thinking, and spiritual resolve that had carried them through hours of terror and confusion. The red crosses that had seemed small symbols along dusty roads now embodied the resilience, commitment, and interconnected purpose that allowed thousands of disparate individuals to function as a single, enduring force. Thus, the Battle of Dorylaeum represents more than a military victory. It signifies the consolidation of purpose and identity among the Crusader armies, the merging of faith and strategy into coordinated action, and the capacity of European forces to confront the mobile, elusive tactics of the Seljuk Turks. The road to Antioch, though still distant and fraught with danger, now lay open, a path marked by endurance, unity, and the hard-won lessons of both human suffering and divine aspiration. The armies continued their march, carrying with them the memory of dust, heat, and arrows, but also the knowledge that the vision of Jerusalem, distant and radiant, had become a tangible destination toward which every step, every sacrifice, and every prayer was inexorably drawn. After the arduous march across Anatolia, the Crusader armies finally approached the storied city of Antioch, perched on the Orontes River and fortified by walls that had withstood centuries of sieges. From a distance, the city rose like a stone sentinel against the landscape, its battlements stretching in sweeping arcs, towers punctuating the skyline, and gates massive enough to admit the proudest horse or the heaviest wagon. Once known as the Jewel of Syria, Antioch had been a thriving center of commerce, culture, and political influence, its markets bustling with merchants from Byzantium, the Levant, and beyond. Now it presented itself as both a goal and an obstacle, a city whose grandeur was matched only by the challenge it imposed on those who sought to enter its walls. The approach to Antioch was slow, calculated, and burdened with the knowledge that the Seljuks and local Muslim forces had not been idle. Scouts returned with reports of patrols along the roads, spies observing the Crusader columns, and potential ambushes in the surrounding hills. Water sources were few, and the region's harsh climate, intensified by the summer sun, left men and animals exhausted and dehydrated. Dust clung to every surface, penetrating clothing and armor, while winds stirred the heat across plains and ridges, making every step feel heavier than the last. Horses faltered under packs and riders, wagons sank into the loose soil, and supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Each contingent moved with caution, aware that rashness could result in disaster before even reaching the city walls. Upon arrival, the Crusaders surveyed Antioch with awe, apprehension, and a growing awareness of the siege to come. Its walls were formidable, rising nearly 40 feet in places, constructed of thick stone and reinforced with towers at regular intervals. The gates were iron-bound and heavily guarded, while the interior streets were narrow, winding, and fortified with gates and barricades that could slow or disrupt any sudden assault. Even from the outside, one could sense the complexity of the city, a labyrinth of streets, gardens, temples, and cisterns, all designed to withstand extended attacks. The Seljuk defenders, familiar with both siegecraft and the terrain, had prepared for a prolonged confrontation, knowing that the sheer size of the Crusader army, while impressive, could also create logistical strain over time. The first days of encampment were dedicated to assessment and preparation. Crusader leaders, drawing on lessons from Nicaea and Dorylaeum, organized divisions and positioned troops around key approaches to the city. Siege engines were surveyed and repaired, towers for assault were constructed, and pickets were posted to prevent surprise attacks. Horses were watered at intermittent points, soldiers rationed their meager supplies, and chaplains consecrated the camps with prayer, blessing both the men and their weapons. The act of establishing encampments became itself a ritual, blending strategy and faith. The placement of tents, the alignment of wagons, and the raising of crosses all reflected both military necessity and spiritual devotion. Yet the city's defenders did not remain passive. Seljuk forces conducted sporadic sorties, harassing Crusader pickets, targeting supply convoys, and testing the resolve of the attackers. Archers would rain arrows from the walls, cavalry would dart from the surrounding countryside to attack isolated units, and the psychological pressure of a distant watchful enemy weighed heavily on the besiegers. Even small skirmishes carried the potential for significant casualties, for in this harsh terrain, disorder could quickly magnify into disaster. Soldiers learned quickly to maintain cohesion, to protect vulnerable flanks, and to respect the dual threats of the environment and the enemy. As the siege settled into rhythm, the psychological toll became evident. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. Heat and dust were constant companions. Food and water remained scarce. Disease began to creep into the encampments, carried by fatigue, malnutrition, and close quarters. Chroniclers recount that soldiers witnessed fellow knights or peasants succumb to illness or exhaustion, often buried hastily near their camps. Sleep was fitful, taken in short shifts, often under the stars, while ever-present fear of sudden attacks haunted both leaders and rank and file alike. Amid these conditions, patience and endurance became as critical as weapons or strategy, and the Crusaders' faith, tested continually, became the central sustenance for both morale and determination. Within the camps, social hierarchies and relationships were shaped by necessity. Nobles enforced discipline, allocated resources, and mediated disputes. Soldiers and pilgrims, though differing in status, learned to cooperate for mutual survival. Chaplains and priests were constant presences, offering spiritual guidance, comforting the sick, and conducting rituals to sanctify both the siege and the endurance it required. The Red Cross, prominent on surcoats and shields, became not just an emblem of faith, but a symbol of collective perseverance, marking the army as a unit bound by shared purpose, despite the physical and emotional trials they faced. Efforts to breach Antioch's walls required slow, methodical work. Siege engines, including catapults and towers, were constructed and positioned with care, often under the threat of enemy fire. Mining operations were attempted to undermine walls, while smaller sorties probed for weaknesses in the gates and fortifications. Every action demanded coordination, patience, and relentless attention, as the smallest misstep could result in injury or death. Leaders instructed men to remain vigilant, to rotate duty shifts, and to ration both physical and spiritual energy, creating a rhythm that balanced effort, rest, and prayer in an environment dominated by scarcity and tension. The city's presence was a constant reminder of both ambition and peril. Its massive walls, the fortified gates, and the knowledge of the defenders' skill and experience made it clear that Antioch would not yield easily. The Crusaders' previous victories at Nicaea and Dorylaeum had prepared them for some challenges, yet the siege of a city this size and complexity introduced a new dimension of trial. Time itself became both enemy and teacher. Each passing day emphasized the need for endurance, for meticulous planning, and for the ability to maintain unity amid exhaustion and fear. Psychological resilience became as vital as martial skill, and the experience began to shape a collective identity grounded not merely in faith or conquest, but in the capacity to endure prolonged hardship together. Thus, the arrival at Antioch transformed the journey from a march punctuated by battles into a protracted trial of patience, strategy, and human endurance. The city's walls stood as both physical and symbolic barriers, requiring not only military skill but steadfastness of spirit. Every day spent under the shadow of Antioch's battlements reinforced the understanding that the road to Jerusalem would demand not simply courage and piety, but an unwavering commitment to perseverance in the face of unrelenting challenge. The Crusaders had reached a pivotal point, a city of immense historical and strategic significance, whose capture would require the utmost combination of patience, strategy, and faith, setting the stage for months of siege that would consume countless lives and shape the future of the crusading endeavor. As autumn bled into winter of 1097, the Crusader encampments around Antioch became a landscape of struggle and endurance, the effects of prolonged siege settling like frost across men, animals, and the sparse provisions that remained. The city itself, massive and forbidding, stood unchanged, its walls impervious to direct assault and its defenders as vigilant as ever. The plains and ridges surrounding Antioch, once dust-strewn and sun-scorched, had turned cold and unforgiving, with biting winds sweeping through the encampments, penetrating layers of clothing and armor alike. Frost crept along tents and wagons, coating provisions with a glimmering crust, and the water in nearby streams partially froze during nights of severe cold. Every man, from the proudest knight to the humblest foot soldier, became intimately aware of the sheer force of the elements, and the battle against the city's walls was now joined by the relentless contest against weather, hunger, and disease. Provisions dwindled to near insufficiency. The Crusaders had anticipated some scarcity, yet the siege extended beyond all expectations. Grain and salted meat, carefully rationed, was supplemented with what could be foraged, roots, wild herbs, and occasionally small game, yet these meager meals barely sustained men weakened from months of marching, skirmishes, and previous battles. Some were driven to boil leather belts, straps, and old harnesses in water to extract whatever sustenance might be gained, a testament to the severity of famine and the lengths to which desperation could drive even disciplined soldiers. Horses and pack animals suffered similarly, subsisting on scrub or sparse fodder, many collapsing from exhaustion, disease, or starvation. further complicating supply lines and mobility. Disease spread with a quiet inevitability. Dysentery, fevers, and infections swept through the camps, exacerbated by crowded tents, inadequate sanitation, and the constant movement of men and animals. Chroniclers describe the pervasive stench of illness mingling with smoke from fires, animal waste, and decaying provisions. Mortality increased, and graves were dug hastily near the perimeters of encampments, often unmarked and forgotten in the icy soil. Families who had accompanied crusaders, including women and children, suffered as well, their vulnerability compounded by fatigue, exposure, and insufficient nutrition. The winter siege transformed the landscape into a theater of human vulnerability, a test of endurance that rivaled any battle fought with sword or bow. Amid these trials, morale faltered and resilience was continually challenged. Soldiers, weary and shivering, questioned their purpose, their faith flickering like torches threatened by wind. Nightly prayers and blessings persisted, yet doubt and despair accompanied them into the cold darkness, mingling with the groans of the sick and the silent fears of those awaiting the uncertain dawn. Officers and priests worked tirelessly to maintain cohesion, moving through the camps to organize guard rotations, distribute remaining food, and encourage men to persevere. Collective ritual, mass, prayer, and communal reflection became essential anchors for both mental stability and spiritual reassurance. Encampments themselves bore the marks of endurance. Tents, often pitched in haste, sagged under frost and snow. Fires were limited by scarce fuel, producing more smoke than warmth. Soldiers huddled in groups, sharing body heat and murmured prayers, while officers conducted rounds to prevent desertion, panic, or collapse of morale. Every mundane task, drawing water from a near-frozen stream, chopping sparse wood for fuel, tending a sick animal, became an exercise in persistence. Even small successes, such as capturing a supply caravan or harvesting edible roots from surrounding lands, provided relief and reinforced the perception that survival required constant vigilance and collaboration. Psychologically, the siege tested the Crusaders in profound ways. The monotony of cold days, punctuated only by raids, disease outbreaks, or scouting reports, wore on even the most steadfast men. The landscape seemed to stretch endlessly, the city's walls a perpetual shadow looming above the frozen plain. Chroniclers note that some soldiers experienced hallucinations or visions, interpreting them as divine messages or warnings. Fear of ambush persisted, but it was compounded by a more insidious enemy: the creeping despair that accompanies hunger, isolation, and exposure. Faith, once an abstract motivator, became tangible sustenance, the only force capable of bolstering men against both physical and spiritual exhaustion. Leadership faced extraordinary pressure. Nobles, responsible not only for tactical decisions, but also for the survival of men under their command, had to balance the need for continued siege operations with the imperative to preserve the army. Decisions regarding rationing, patrols, scouting missions, and rotations of duty became matters of life and death. Coordination with Byzantine allies remained a distant consideration, complicated by limited communication and competing priorities, yet the necessity of maintaining cohesion across vast numbers of soldiers was paramount. Each action, from sending small foraging parties to reinforcing vulnerable positions, carried the weight of immediate survival and the long-term viability of the campaign. Despite all adversity, retreat was never considered. The vision of Jerusalem, distant and radiant, persisted in collective consciousness, a lodestar guiding men through the frost and hunger. Stories circulated of miraculous deliverance, divine favor, or the impending intervention of God himself, sustaining hope when material resources had failed. Soldiers clung to symbols of faith, crosses, relics, and the memory of previous victories at Nicaea and Dorylaeum. Each day survived reinforced a shared narrative. Endurance in suffering was itself a form of devotion, a tangible reflection of the spiritual imperative that had first drawn these men across Europe and into the Levant. As winter deepened, the siege continued in slow, unyielding rhythm. Watchmen patrolled frozen trenches, scouts observed distant approaches, and laborers maintained rudimentary siege engines despite frost-chilled hands. Fires burned low to conserve wood, tents shivered in the wind, and the plain outside the city became a patchwork of frost, footprints, and hastily dug graves. The human landscape mirrored the physical one, exhausted, scarred, and yet persisting, bound by shared purpose and the tenuous hope of future deliverance. Hunger and disease were constant, yet discipline, leadership, and faith allowed the army to remain intact, however fragilely, poised for the decisive moments that would soon define the siege. Thus, winter at Antioch was not merely a season but a trial, a crucible in which physical, mental, and spiritual endurance were tested to the limits. Men endured starvation, frost, disease, and despair, yet they persevered, driven by a combination of discipline, leadership, and the promise of divine sanction. Every day that passed strengthened the resilience of the Crusaders, shaping them into a force capable not only of confronting fortified cities, but of withstanding the most extreme tests of human perseverance. From this prolonged suffering would emerge the readiness for extraordinary events, moments of vision and courage that would alter the course of the siege and ultimately the broader crusading endeavor. Months of encirclement, suffering, and relentless tension had brought the Crusaders to a point of frayed nerves and exhaustion, yet their resolve remained unbroken. Within the city of Antioch, the defenders, weary from the prolonged siege and the relentless pressure of the surrounding Crusader forces, faced a combination of dwindling supplies, disease, and the psychological weight of watching a vast, patient army encircle them day by day. The winter chill had eased into the early warmth of spring, but the city, though resilient, bore the marks of hardship. Stores of food had been exhausted, morale faltered among soldiers, and the ever-present threat of betrayal and espionage hung in the shadows. For the Crusaders, the months of hardship had fostered patience, discipline, and a collective understanding that every day survived was a preparation for decisive action. Yet even they could not anticipate the pivotal moment that would bring about the fall of the city. The opportunity came unexpectedly, shrouded in secrecy and risk. A tower gate, one of the many defensive points of Antioch, opened under circumstances that remain a mixture of rumor, interpretation, and chronicler accounts. Some suggest that a citizen or minor official within the city, disillusioned by the hardships and drawn by promises of reward or mercy, betrayed their fellow defenders. Others hint at complex arrangements orchestrated by Byzantine agents or rival factions within the city's governing class. Whatever the exact circumstances, the result was unmistakable, a passage wide enough for the Crusaders to pour into the city with a suddenness that shocked both the defenders and the besiegers themselves. The night air, already tense with expectation and fatigue, filled with the sounds of movement, clanging armor, and whispered prayers as knights and infantry prepared for the assault. The Crusaders moved like a tide of spectral determination through the opened gate, their numbers swelling as more men surged into the city's streets. The familiar rhythm of marching and siege gave way to the chaos of urban conquest, though it was a chaos disciplined by months of hardship and tactical experience. Soldiers ascended towers, cleared streets, and pressed forward with a mixture of resolve and exhaustion. The defenders, caught by surprise and demoralized by betrayal from within, attempted resistance but were fragmented, uncoordinated, and ultimately unable to contain the onslaught. Street by street, tower by tower, the Crusaders advanced, bringing the long arduous siege to a sudden climactic conclusion. Antioch fell into their hands, yet the victory was far from simple triumph. The city, battered by months of siege, hunger and disease, offered little comfort. Civilians, soldiers, and even some of the Crusaders themselves were too weakened to celebrate fully. Supplies were scarce, fortifications had been damaged or neglected, and the streets bore the marks of conflict and deprivation. The elation of entry was shadowed by the knowledge that possession of the city did not equate to security. Indeed, as chroniclers repeatedly emphasize, the Crusaders' relief at capturing Antioch was immediately tempered by the realization that they were now surrounded in turn. From the east and northeast, forces loyal to the Seljuk Turks and other regional powers moved to invest the city, seeking to reverse the conquest and punish the intruders who had endured such a prolonged march and siege. In these initial days within Antioch, the Crusaders faced a city transformed by scarcity and desperation. Wells were contaminated or insufficient for the swollen population, granaries were depleted, and livestock had been either consumed or hidden. Disease, already present from the siege, continued to spread through narrow alleys and crowded quarters. Men were forced to improvise, scavenging for food, water, and medicine, while fortifying gates and walls hastily against the imminent counterattack. Strategic considerations became immediate concerns: which towers could be defended effectively, how to deploy limited cavalry and infantry, and how to maintain communication across streets that had not yet been secured. The city, though theirs in name, required constant vigilance and resourcefulness to hold against the approaching armies of the East. Psychologically, the shift from besieger to besieged had profound effects. Soldiers who had endured months of encirclement, hunger, frost, and disease now faced the paradoxical challenge of defending a city they had so recently assaulted. Fear, already tempered by experience, became focused on the possibilities of ambush, infiltration, and sudden attack from superior numbers. Officers reinforced discipline rigorously, organizing rotations, constructing barricades, and establishing watch patterns. Chaplains continued to provide spiritual guidance, reminding men that endurance, faith, and courage remained paramount, even in circumstances where triumph was overshadowed by vulnerability. Despite the immediate peril, the Crusaders' morale drew strength from prior trials. The experiences of long marches, the battle at Dorylaeum, and the prolonged winter siege had forged resilience, adaptability, and cohesion. Leaders coordinated counterattacks against probing forces, managed scarce supplies, and maintained lines of communication within the complex urban environment. Every action, no matter how small, carried the weight of both survival and spiritual purpose. The memory of the journey from Europe, of endless plains, burning sun, frost, dust, and exhaustion, became a source of fortitude, reminding soldiers that they had endured far more than most could imagine, and that the vision of Jerusalem remained the ultimate prize that justified continued perseverance. Thus, the fall of Antioch, precipitated by betrayal and executed with sudden disciplined force, was a victory fraught with both triumph and foreboding. The Crusaders had achieved what seemed impossible after months of encirclement, famine, and exposure to the elements. Yet the city's capture introduced an immediate new challenge. They were now besieged themselves, surrounded by forces intent on reclaiming the jewel of Syria. Antioch became a microcosm of the crusading endeavor itself, a place where faith, endurance, strategy, and circumstance collided, producing a victory inseparable from struggle and risk. Every step forward, every tower seized, and every street cleared reinforced the fragile balance between success and vulnerability, teaching the Crusaders once more that even in moments of apparent triumph, the forces of adversity remained ever present, demanding vigilance, courage, and unity. The Crusaders found themselves trapped within Antioch, a city that they had captured at immense cost, only to realize that the surrounding plains now teemed with enemy forces. Hunger, fatigue, disease, and the weight of uncertainty bore heavily on men already weakened by months of siege and extreme deprivation. Each alley and tower of the city seemed simultaneously a haven and a trap, a space where triumph coexisted with the ever-present danger of sudden defeat. Morale, fragile from the winter and months of unrelenting pressure, teetered on the edge, and whispers of despair spread through the encampments and streets. Men questioned the purpose of their suffering, and even the most disciplined knights felt the grip of hopelessness as provisions dwindled and disease persisted. It was in this crucible of exhaustion and desperation that Peter Bartholomew, a humble French priest and former servant of the army, emerged with a claim that would reshape the spirit of the crusade. Peter declared that he had been guided in a series of visions to the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion. According to his account, the visions were vivid and unambiguous, directing him to a specific location within the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch. Exhausted, sick, and physically enfeebled, the Crusaders nevertheless gathered to witness the event. Skepticism was tempered by the pervasive desire for hope, and the discovery of the lance, encased in the sacred soil and unearthed by Peter's trembling hands, became a symbol that transcended mere object. It was a manifestation of divine favor, a physical sign that God had not abandoned the Crusaders despite months of hardship. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Soldiers, knights, and pilgrims who had been on the brink of despair now perceived the campaign not as a series of misfortunes, but as a divinely sanctioned mission in which every hardship endured was a test of faith. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion, previously oppressive, were reframed as trials that strengthened the spirit and demonstrated devotion. In camps along city walls and within the battered streets, men knelt in prayer, wept openly, and renewed vows of obedience to their leaders and to God. The presence of the Holy Lance, though simple in its physical form, became a powerful catalyst for unity, courage, and renewed vigor, reshaping the mindset of the army in ways that strategic planning, logistics, or even battlefield experience could not have achieved alone. In the following days, the army, inspired by the vision, began to prepare for action with a renewed sense of purpose. Leaders such as Bohemond of Taranto, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Raymond of Toulouse organized the troops, emphasizing both tactical discipline and spiritual motivation. The morale boost was tangible. Men who had been too weak to stand for long periods now carried weapons with renewed strength. Archers drew their bows with steadier hands, and cavalry units readied themselves for sorties with a newfound sense of inevitability. Each member of the army, from veteran knights to simple foot soldiers, internalized a shared belief that divine intervention had transformed the campaign, providing both mandate and favor for the trials yet to come. The subsequent sortie from Antioch demonstrated the tangible effects of this spiritual revitalization. The Crusaders, guided by both strategy and belief in divine protection, coordinated a defense against the encircling forces, exploiting the morale and cohesion instilled by the presence of the Holy Lance. Formations held where they might otherwise have faltered, counterattacks were executed with precision despite exhaustion, and reconnaissance units moved confidently through contested areas. Chroniclers note that the sight of the lance itself, sometimes carried in processions or displayed before lines of men, served as both emblem and talisman, bolstering courage and reinforcing the perception of divine favor in the hearts and minds of all who beheld it. The psychological interplay between belief and action became particularly evident during moments of intense combat. Soldiers reported feeling shielded from arrows, guided in movement, and strengthened in endurance, interpreting natural phenomena, sudden wind shifts, unexpected reinforcements, or even misfires among enemy ranks, as manifestations of divine will. This perception further reinforced unity among diverse contingents, forging a collective identity based not solely on shared hardship, but on a shared narrative of divine purpose and intervention. In effect, the vision of the Holy Lance transformed the siege from a test of physical endurance into a crucible of spiritual conviction, with tangible outcomes in morale, cohesion, and battlefield effectiveness. As spring advanced, the Crusaders leveraged this renewed vigor to break the encirclement and secure Antioch. Organized sorties, fortified positions, and strategic engagements allowed them to fend off the surrounding forces, stabilize the city's defenses, and begin securing supply routes essential for the survival of men and animals alike. The combination of experience gained from the long march, knowledge of the local terrain, and the psychological boost provided by the Holy Lance enabled the Crusaders to transform a precarious situation into one of relative strategic control. Antioch, once a city that had tested them to the brink of despair, now became a stronghold that showcased both human endurance and the perceived hand of divine favor guiding their campaign. Ultimately, the discovery of the Holy Lance marked a turning point in the siege of Antioch, reshaping the Crusaders' approach to leadership, combat, and faith. Exhausted men who had been on the verge of collapse now found renewed strength, unity, and purpose. The vision, whether interpreted as miraculous or as a powerful psychological catalyst, facilitated decisive action, allowing the Crusaders to survive, consolidate, and ultimately continue their march toward the ultimate objective of Jerusalem. The interplay of belief, endurance, and strategic acumen demonstrated in these weeks became emblematic of the broader First Crusade itself, a campaign in which faith, hardship, and human ingenuity intertwined to produce outcomes that were neither immediate nor easily predicted, yet fundamentally transformative in the lives of those who endured them. The city of Antioch, having been wrested from months of siege, provided a temporary reprieve for the Crusaders, yet it also marked the threshold of a journey far more arduous than any previous endeavor. Spring was giving way to the full heat of early summer, and the survivors of the winter, already thinned by disease, starvation, and combat, began to take stock of what remained. Horses were gaunt, weapons chipped and worn, armor dented and corroded by months of exposure, and yet the spirit of the army, galvanized by the vision of the Holy Lance, carried them forward. The road to Jerusalem stretched southward through arid plains, rolling hills, and the ruins of cities long abandoned or devastated by prior conflicts, forming a landscape that seemed simultaneously sacred, desolate, and forbidding. From the walls of Antioch, the Crusaders moved like a deliberate, trudging river, their banners snapping in the wind, and their armor glinting faintly in the rising sun. Every step demanded endurance. Dust rose from dry roads, the heat of the sun burned exposed skin, and the scent of arid soil mixed with the sweat of both men and animals. Supply trains creaked under the weight of provisions, tents, and siege materials, salvaged or rebuilt after the siege, while the constant need to scout ahead for water, forage, and potential ambushes shaped each day's rhythm. Streams and wells were few, and men learned to ration every drop, share sparingly with horses, and employ crude filtration methods to stave off illness. Every decision about pace, rest, or diversion carried consequences that could ripple through the army for miles. The land itself seemed to narrate the passage of time and the memory of past civilizations. Ruins of Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine settlements stood along the route, their stones weathered into shapes that evoked both awe and melancholy. Crumbled walls, fallen columns, and empty cisterns told silent stories of civilizations that had risen, flourished, and fallen long before the Crusaders' arrival. Pilgrims accompanying the armies, their eyes accustomed now to suffering and endurance, often paused to touch the remnants of sacred structures, imagining prayers whispered centuries before. Even as they moved, the landscape seemed to impose reflection and meditation. The arid winds, the distant hills, and the deserted villages contributed to a sense that the journey was not merely physical but spiritual, a passage through time as much as through space. Encounters with local populations varied widely, from hospitality to hostility. Villages along the way provided opportunities to replenish supplies, barter for food, or seek guidance, yet mistrust and fear of the Crusaders often led to tension or skirmishes. Some towns were abandoned, leaving empty streets and silent homes, while others offered cautious welcome, particularly if the Crusaders' reputation for both piety and martial prowess preceded them. Each interaction required negotiation, diplomacy, and sometimes force, blending the tactical, logistical, and human dimensions of the campaign. Leaders balanced the need for speed with caution, knowing that a single miscalculation could imperil the weakened army or invite disaster from hidden adversaries. Psychologically, the march exacted a toll that went beyond physical fatigue. Men who had endured frost, starvation, and disease at Antioch now faced blistering heat, endless plains, and the relentless psychological strain of anticipation. The image of Jerusalem, distant and radiant, dominated thoughts, dreams, and prayers, a beacon of purpose and salvation. Yet for many, the city existed as both a promise and a torment. The closer it seemed to come, the more tangible the potential for death, failure, or spiritual trial. Soldiers, pilgrims, and clergy alike found solace in ritual and routine, prayers at dawn, blessings over supplies, and the careful observance of moral and religious discipline, even amid exhaustion. The Red Cross emblazoned on surcoats and banners now symbolized not only faith, but the resilience and continuity of shared endeavor. Alongside spiritual sustenance, practical measures were critical for survival. Officers organized daily rotations, ensuring that watch duties, foraging parties, and labor for maintenance of equipment were distributed to prevent collapse. Cavalry units scouted ahead, guarding against sudden attacks from horse archers or local raiding parties, while infantry maintained a protective line for wagons and pilgrims. Messages and coordination between contingent leaders were continuous and essential, especially given the diversity of nationalities, languages, and military traditions within the Crusader forces. Each mile traversed was both a physical accomplishment and a testament to human organization under extreme stress, revealing lessons in leadership, cooperation, and endurance that would remain vital throughout the remaining journey. Despite exhaustion and scarcity, the movement southward reinforced the unity of the Crusaders. Soldiers shared food and water when possible, comforted the sick, and guided weary comrades along uneven paths. Stories of past trials, from the hardships of Anatolia to the siege of Antioch, became touchstones teaching both patience and courage. Each challenge met and overcome along the road contributed to a growing sense of collective identity, a recognition that survival depended not on individual heroism alone, but on cooperation, discipline, and faith. The army had become a living organism, one in which leadership, camaraderie, and shared purpose were inseparable from the act of simply moving forward toward the holy city. By midsummer, the survivors began to traverse the hills and valleys of Syria, crossing rivers, ravines, and dry plains once alive with civilizations now faded into memory. The landscape demanded constant adaptation, heat sapped strength, dusty winds obscured paths, and intermittent skirmishes with local forces reminded Crusaders that the journey, while no longer beset by the siege of Antioch, was far from secure. Yet each step southward also served to harden them, blending endurance with experience. The men of Godfrey, Bohemond, Raymond, and other leaders became increasingly cohesive, moving with a rhythm honed by months of shared suffering and belief in the ultimate purpose of their expedition. And so the road to Jerusalem was both a physical march and a spiritual passage. Every village crossed, every river forded, and every ruined city passed served as a reminder of the cost of ambition and the persistence of human endeavor. The city itself, distant and yet ever present in imagination, loomed as the ultimate goal, a place where faith, sacrifice, and suffering would be tested to their fullest extent. Each step taken along this long, dusty road intertwined the tangible hardships of survival with the intangible demands of belief, creating a landscape in which endurance, hope, and preparation coalesced. The survivors, thinned and hardened, moved as a singular, relentless force toward the holy city, carrying the accumulated weight of months of siege, vision, and perseverance in every weary stride. As the Crusaders continued their southward march, the landscape of the Levant transformed into a region both eerie and desolate, punctuated by the remnants of civilizations that had once flourished under Roman and Byzantine influence. These were the so-called dead cities of northern Syria, settlements abandoned over centuries due to shifting trade routes, invasions, and political upheaval. Once vibrant towns with colonnaded streets, aqueducts, and sprawling villas now lay silent, their walls fractured and rooftops collapsed, their mosaics dulled by centuries of wind and rain. For the Crusaders, marching through this terrain was a journey not only across space but through time, confronting the tangible traces of history's relentless passage. Each ruined gate, each fallen pillar, each empty fountain became a marker of impermanence, emphasizing the fragility of human endeavor and the relentless march of decay. The psychological impact on the army was profound. Men who had survived frost, famine, and the chaos of siege now faced a different kind of trial: the oppressive silence of abandoned towns and the desolation of lands stripped of life. Horses stumbled over uneven cobblestones, their hooves echoing across empty streets. The wind whistled through broken windows and half-collapsed arches, and the soldiers' footsteps, once accompanied by the murmur of villages or the distant cries of merchants, now fell against an uncanny quiet. Pilgrims and knights alike experienced a sensation of temporal dislocation, a dissonance between the present, filled with physical struggle and anticipation, and the ghostly remnants of lives long extinguished. The dead cities were reminders that civilizations, no matter how mighty, could crumble, leaving only memory and stone behind. The march through these ruins demanded both endurance and caution. Some towns had been looted repeatedly over generations, leaving behind hazards in the form of collapsed structures, hidden wells, and fractured walls. The Crusaders, already weakened by months of prior campaigns, moved with careful attention to both terrain and logistics. Supply lines were delicate, and the army had to scavenge what food, water, and shelter they could from the ruins, while ensuring that movement remained continuous. The rhythm of march, rest, prayer, and rationing became almost meditative, as soldiers adapted to a pattern that was dictated as much by survival as by military discipline. Every mile was measured not simply by distance, but by the endurance of body, mind, and faith. The dead cities also offered moments of reflection and narrative reinforcement. Pilgrims and clergy interpreted the ruins as symbols of divine will, morality, and human transience. Temples and churches, even in their ruined states, were approached reverently, and prayers were offered in acknowledgement of the past and for the success of the journey ahead. Knights, hardened by combat yet touched by awe at the remnants of ancient craftsmanship, sometimes paused to examine mosaics, columns, and inscriptions, noting the artistry and the inevitable decay. The juxtaposition of human achievement and decline mirrored the Crusaders' own situation, exhausted, battle-worn, and pursuing a seemingly distant goal, yet driven by faith, vision, and collective determination. Despite the haunting stillness, the army remained vigilant. Scouts and cavalry rode ahead to detect signs of ambush or local resistance, while infantry protected the flanks and rear. Although many towns were empty, some small communities remained, often guarded or suspicious of the foreign army. The Crusaders, aware of both the logistical need for food and the strategic necessity of maintaining discipline, approached each encounter with a mixture of caution, negotiation, and occasional force. Each small action, a rationed meal, a repaired wagon, a cleared path through rubble, became essential for the survival of the larger expedition. The campaign was no longer defined solely by pitched battles, but by the continuous navigation of a hostile and often lifeless environment. Mentally, the desolation forced soldiers and pilgrims to confront both vulnerability and purpose. The emptiness of the dead cities accentuated the fragility of life and the inevitability of death, echoing the harsh realities they had faced since leaving Europe. Yet these same ruins also became symbols of resilience. Though stone walls had crumbled and empires had faded, human memory and narrative endured. The Crusaders internalized this lesson, recognizing that their campaign too was both temporary and monumental, a fleeting moment in the long history of the land, yet one imbued with profound spiritual and historical significance. The army's progression through the Levant was measured, deliberate, and often exhausting. Days of marching under scorching sun alternated with nights of sleepless vigilance, the soldiers and pilgrims forced to remain alert to the possibility of enemy harassment or natural hazards. Water sources were scarce, wells often brackish or partially collapsed, and foraging required careful coordination to avoid depletion and maintain morale. Leadership played a crucial role. Bohemond, Godfrey, Raymond, and other commanders continually organized rotations, delegated authority, and reinforced both practical and spiritual cohesion, ensuring that exhaustion did not dissolve the hard-won unity forged through years of campaign. Through this landscape of ruins, the Crusaders' sense of urgency intensified. The dead cities, as much as the roads, hills, and rivers they traversed, were markers along a path toward Jerusalem, a tangible reminder that history, struggle, and mortality intersected in ways both humbling and motivating. Each mile covered was a triumph of endurance and faith, a testament to the capacity of humans to persist in the face of physical deprivation, psychological strain, and environmental challenge. the desolation around them, rather than breaking resolve, sharpened focus, compelling men to move ever forward, step by step, toward the ultimate objective that had drawn them from Europe, across mountains, rivers and deserts, the holy city, radiant in both expectation and imagination. By the time the Crusaders emerged from the northern Levantine hills and approached the plains of Palestine, their army was markedly transformed. The passage through the dead cities had thinned their ranks, strengthened their cohesion, and deepened the shared consciousness of suffering and purpose. Soldiers and pilgrims alike carried the imprint of ruined civilizations, the lessons of endurance, and the persistent hope instilled by prior victories and visions. Every footfall on dusty roads, every glance at crumbling walls and empty squares, reinforced a singular truth that survival, perseverance and belief were as critical as martial skill in the realization of their campaign. Ahead lay the fortified towns, desert plains, and finally the gates of Jerusalem itself, yet each step through the dead lands had already forged men and army alike into something capable of confronting both the tangible and symbolic challenges awaiting them. As the Crusaders pressed further southward, the Levantine landscape began to shift subtly yet unmistakably. The vast plains and dusty ruins of northern Syria gave way to rolling hills, the soil tinged red under the increasingly relentless sun, a hue that seemed to signal both danger and promise. Olive groves appeared sporadically, their gnarled trunks bending in the warm winds, carrying the distinct scent of resin and earth. These trees, ancient and resilient, seemed like silent witnesses to centuries of human history, enduring empires, conflicts, and the passage of countless generations. The Crusaders, fatigued yet driven by the vision of Jerusalem, took note of each landmark, each bend in the road, and each isolated village, understanding intuitively that the land itself was changing as they neared their ultimate destination. The hills of Judea presented both relief and challenge. Unlike the monotony of the northern deserts and the ruined cities, the terrain offered cover, shade, and sources of fresh water, yet it also required constant physical exertion. Columns of soldiers ascended steep inclines, their armor heavy, their shields laden, every step a negotiation between balance and endurance. Pack animals groaned under loads of provisions, siege materials and weapons, while horses, already lean from months of sparse fodder, struggled to maintain footing on uneven tracks. Dust rose with each passage, mingling with the scent of sun-baked earth and the faint aroma of wild herbs. The heat pressed down during the day, while nights brought sharp coolness across the hills, making sleep an intermittent and restless affair for both men and beasts alike. The natural beauty of the hills contrasted sharply with the psychological strain of the Crusaders, climbing winding paths. The soldiers caught glimpses of the valleys below, the scattered villages, and the occasional monastery perched atop hills, offering markers of both civilization and faith. Yet these scenes also reminded them of vulnerability. Every grove might conceal raiders, every ridge might conceal ambushes, and every valley demanded careful reconnaissance. Scouts sent ahead to verify paths and check for hidden enemy forces reported back continuously, their accounts dictating the army's pace, routes, and encampment strategies. Coordination became paramount, for the hills, while providing cover, also fractured lines and slowed the already weary columns, testing leadership, discipline, and communication among diverse contingents. Psychologically, the approach through the hills deepened both anticipation and anxiety. The soldiers and pilgrims, having endured years of hardships from Europe to Antioch, understood that every mile now carried enormous significance. Each step brought them closer to the city that had been the focus of prayers, dreams, and sacrifices for months, yet also toward the formidable challenge of siege and combat that lay ahead. The sight of Jerusalem's distant walls, visible across the valleys on certain clear days, became a source of both hope and tension. The landscape itself, red earth, twisted trees, and distant ridges, seemed almost to echo the intensity of the Crusaders' faith and the weight of history upon their shoulders. Along the way, encounters with local populations reflected the complex political and cultural fabric of southern Palestine. Some villages offered cautious hospitality, sharing water or guiding travelers to reliable springs and shaded paths. Others remained watchful, wary of the foreign army and the potential disruption of local governance. Occasionally, skirmishes erupted with small bands of defenders or raiders, attempting to disrupt the Crusaders' progress. These encounters, though minor compared to prior sieges, required careful negotiation, rapid tactical response, and constant vigilance. Leaders emphasized both discipline and patience, reminding soldiers that preservation of life, morale, and resources was as critical as the ultimate conquest of Jerusalem itself. The physical exertion of marching through the hills was compounded by the relentless heat, thin air, and the ongoing psychological strain of long campaigns. Soldiers experienced blisters, exhaustion, and sunstroke, while pilgrims struggled with the same fatigue in lighter clothing, often carrying heavy burdens or supplies. Horses and pack animals, their strength diminished over the journey, required careful management. Water had to be rationed, paths selected to reduce strain, and pauses timed to allow recovery. Every small success, a spring discovered, a cleared pass, or a successfully negotiated passage through a village, reinforced cohesion and morale, yet each also underscored the fragility of the army's endurance. The spiritual dimension of the march became increasingly pronounced. Pilgrims and soldiers alike interpreted the hills, the groves, and the distant views of the city as signs of divine proximity. Chaplains led prayers at dawn and dusk, often on hilltops that offered a view of Jerusalem's skyline. Masses were conducted wherever open ground permitted, blending the necessity of faith with the practicalities of movement. For many soldiers, the experience of traversing these sacred yet challenging lands transformed physical endurance into spiritual practice, a meditation on suffering, devotion, and the moral significance of their campaign. Each step, each climb, and each pause became intertwined with the broader narrative of holy purpose that had drawn them from Europe. As the Crusaders advanced, the hills themselves became markers of progression, a subtle but persistent measure of distance and effort. Valleys, ridges, and scattered villages punctuated the journey, offering moments of rest, reflection, and strategic assessment. Scouts and officers continuously mapped terrain, monitored water sources, and observed potential defensive positions, all while maintaining the steady pace necessary to reach Jerusalem before supplies ran out or enemy reinforcements could consolidate. The rhythm of the march, exertion, rest, prayer, rationing, and vigilance, created a living cycle that governed both individual endurance and collective cohesion. Ultimately, the hills of Judea represented both the tangible and symbolic threshold to Jerusalem. They marked the transition from the long, desolate plains and ruined cities of the north to the sacred landscape of Palestine, the region of profound religious significance and historical resonance. Every incline climbed, every valley crossed, and every grooved path traversed brought the Crusaders closer to the culmination of their journey. Fatigue, hunger, and fear persisted, yet so did anticipation, faith, and determination. The army that had departed Europe months before, diminished in numbers yet hardened by hardship, now moved as a unified force through the hills, their eyes set upon the city that had dominated prayers, dreams, and the imagination of Christendom for generations. As the first glimpses of Jerusalem's distant fortifications appeared beyond the rolling hills, the Crusaders felt the convergence of exhaustion, awe, and expectation. The landscape itself, the red earth, twisted olive groves, and gentle slopes, framed the city as a destination simultaneously real and ethereal, a goal that promised both fulfillment and trial. The hills of Judea had shaped the army's endurance, deepened their collective consciousness, and prepared them physically and spiritually for the monumental endeavor that lay ahead, the siege that would decide whether months of suffering, vision, and faith would culminate in the long-awaited capture of the Holy City. By early June of 1099, the Crusaders had reached the outskirts of Jerusalem. their numbers greatly diminished but their determination intensified by months of relentless exertion, deprivation, and the enduring hope inspired by prior trials. The city, perched upon its hills and fortified by generations of careful construction, loomed before them as both a tangible target and a sacred symbol, the culmination of journeys spanning thousands of miles. Every soldier, pilgrim and leader understood that the coming weeks would demand the entirety of their physical endurance, strategic ingenuity, and spiritual conviction. The hills and plains that led to Jerusalem, once markers of progression and challenge, now served as the immediate theatre of a confrontation whose consequences would echo across Christendom. The sun bore down relentlessly, saturating the landscape with heat that seemed to drain strength and spirit alike. The red soil of the Judean hills became a source of dust and reflection as men trudged over rocky paths, their boots scuffed and their faces coated with the residue of the dry terrain. Horses, already emaciated from long marches and previous campaigns, struggled under the combined weight of supplies, riders, and armor, while the infantry contended with the oppressive sun, the uneven ground, and the constant vigilance required to prevent surprise attacks. Water, the lifeblood of the army, was scarce, and men measured each ration with painstaking care, their thirst a constant reminder of both vulnerability and the unforgiving nature of the region. Despite exhaustion, the Crusaders demonstrated remarkable adaptability and engineering skill. Timber, salvaged from nearby villages, palaces, and ruined structures, was repurposed into siege towers, ladders, and makeshift platforms. Carpentry teams worked tirelessly in the heat, the rhythm of hammer striking wood echoing across the encampments, mingling with the whispered prayers, the chants of mass, and the murmurs of anticipation. Every piece of equipment represented both ingenuity and hope, a tangible extension of the soldiers' belief that physical preparation, skill, and faith combined to create opportunities against formidable fortifications. Siege engines were positioned carefully, protected from enemy fire where possible, while the army coordinated labor across units, ensuring that no single section of the line would be left vulnerable. The approach to the city itself demanded strategic acumen. Crusaders identified weak points, scouted the terrain, and organized formations that could respond to sallies from defenders. Commanders moved constantly among the ranks, directing efforts, reinforcing positions, and maintaining discipline amidst the growing anxiety of the approaching confrontation. Men, though exhausted, understood that hesitation could cost lives, and that the sacred significance of Jerusalem lent every action both urgency and gravity. Pilgrims and non-combatants, while less directly involved in construction or combat, contributed by tending supplies, assisting the wounded, and sustaining the morale of the army through shared ritual and prayer. Psychologically, the siege tested faith, perseverance, and collective cohesion to the utmost degree. The proximity of Jerusalem, long imagined and prayed for, created a tension between elation and dread. The city was simultaneously the goal of a spiritual journey and the threshold of potentially fatal conflict. Chroniclers describe soldiers and pilgrims engaging in long periods of meditation, prayer, and reflection on the significance of the city, the journey endured, and the trials yet to come. The interplay of fear and devotion became a defining characteristic of life at the siege lines, as men balanced the practical demands of survival with the spiritual significance of their campaign. Enemy defenders, keenly aware of the Crusaders' diminished strength yet resolute in the defense of their city, responded with constant vigilance. Archers lined the walls, hurling projectiles at approaching laborers and scouts, while towers and gates were reinforced as best possible. The Crusaders countered with ingenuity, constructing towers taller than existing walls where terrain permitted, providing platforms from which to deploy crossbows and archers, and coordinating mass efforts to breach gates or weaken fortifications. Every interaction between attacker and defender became a test of skill, strategy, and endurance, compounded by the harsh environmental conditions that challenged both sides equally. The Crusaders' determination was fueled not only by tactical considerations, but by the enduring weight of faith. Chaplains moved among the ranks, delivering exhortations, celebrating Mass in open spaces, and blessing siege engines, supplies, and soldiers alike. Pilgrims carried sacred relics, while banners adorned with the Red Cross fluttered above camp and city alike, serving as both spiritual and psychological symbols. The combination of religious devotion and strategic planning created a dynamic in which belief reinforced action and action reinforced belief, producing a cycle of motivation and resilience that allowed the Crusaders to maintain cohesion despite dwindling resources, fatigue, and the immense physical demands of siege warfare. As days passed, the Crusaders adapted further to the environment and the defensive strategies of the city. Rations were meticulously managed, watches were rotated to maintain vigilance without excessive fatigue, and engineers constantly refined siege equipment based on observation and experience. Supply lines were stretched, yet foragers and scouts worked tirelessly to secure food, water, and timber from the surrounding hills, often negotiating cautiously with local populations or reclaiming abandoned resources. The army's cohesion, honed over years of campaign and countless challenges, was tested as never before, yet the shared objective of Jerusalem provided a unifying purpose that sustained morale and focus. In sum, the Siege of Jerusalem in June 1099 was a complex interplay of environmental hardship, engineering ingenuity, disciplined strategy, and spiritual conviction. Every day involved navigation of both physical and psychological challenges: scorching sun, scarce water, weakened bodies, fortified defenses, and the ever-present weight of history and faith. The Crusaders, forged by months of prior hardship, approached each obstacle with a combination of perseverance, skill, and belief that each action, no matter how small, contributed to the eventual realization of their long-sought goal. Within this landscape of heat, dust, and prayer, the stage was set for the dramatic and consequential events that would ultimately determine the fate of the city and the culmination of the First Crusade. As night fell over the encampments surrounding Jerusalem, the city's stone walls rose dark and silent against the horizon, lit only intermittently by torches flickering atop guard towers or held by sentries patrolling the parapets. The air was heavy with the scent of dust, sweat, and the faint smoke of small fires used to prepare scant meals or keep watchfires burning. The Crusaders, having labored under the relentless sun, endured the grueling construction of siege towers, the clearing of rocky approaches, and the endless threat of enemy missiles. Now sought respite, though true rest was elusive. Each man, whether knight, foot soldier, or pilgrim, carried the weight of exhaustion, fear, and anticipation, the long campaign culminating in a moment that seemed suspended between time and eternity. Tents, if present at all, were rudimentary, offering little protection from the chill that crept in with the desert night. Many soldiers lay upon bare ground, wrapped in tattered cloaks or leaning against the scant comfort of a wagon or pile of gear. The physical exhaustion was palpable, muscles cramped from long marches, backs ached from armor and weapons, and every joint and tendon protested the endless strain of climbing hills, carrying supplies, and laboring to construct towering siege engines. Yet alongside the fatigue existed a tension that neither rest nor distraction could fully alleviate. Men whispered prayers, recited psalms, or muttered fragments of scripture, seeking divine favor, protection, or simply solace in words that had carried them across thousands of miles. Others stared silently into the darkness, eyes tracing the faint outlines of distant hills, the city walls, or the stars above, reflecting on the journey and the trial that awaited with the first light. The city itself seemed aware of the impending confrontation. From the walls the defenders moved cautiously, their torches glimmering across battlements, the occasional clatter of chains or footsteps echoing faintly into the night. Archers adjusted positions, gates were reinforced, and watch rotations ensured that no vulnerability went unnoticed. The Crusaders' labor had not gone unseen. Scouts, spies, and occasional skirmishes had made clear that the defenders were alert, vigilant, and prepared to resist the coming storm. For the soldiers resting on the dusty hillsides below, the awareness of these prepared defenses only intensified both anxiety and anticipation. creating a silence that pressed upon the encampments like a tangible weight. Psychologically, the night before the final assault was a crucible in itself. Every soldier carried the memory of months of hardship, frost-bitten plains of Anatolia, hunger in the dead cities, the siege of Antioch, and the relentless march through Judea. Each experience had chipped away at fear, tempered resolve, and hardened bodies, yet the imminence of direct confrontation with Jerusalem's fortifications reawakened primal apprehension. Men whispered to each other in low tones, exchanging fragments of reassurance, recounting lessons learned, or speaking in halting prayers for divine favor. For some, the night became a time of confession, reflection on sins and failures, and preparation of the soul for acts of courage, sacrifice, or perhaps death. The psychological landscape was as complex and demanding as the physical terrain. Courage and fear coexisted, mingled with faith, hope, and a profound awareness of the historical weight of their actions. Spiritual practices punctuated the darkness. Chaplains and priests moved quietly among the rows of resting soldiers, sprinkling holy water, offering blessings over weapons and leading whispered prayers for the protection of the army and the sanctity of the coming action. Banners were placed strategically near leaders' tents or on visible knolls, serving as symbols of both divine purpose and communal cohesion. Pilgrims carried relics and prayer beads, often sitting in contemplative circles, their voices soft but insistent, weaving psalms into the night air. These rituals served not only as spiritual reinforcement, but also as psychological preparation. The shared recognition of divine witness and protection strengthened unity, mitigated fear, and anchored the army in a sense of higher purpose amid the impending chaos of combat. The environment itself seemed to mirror the tension. Cool desert winds whispered through olive groves and rocky outcrops, carrying the faint scent of herbs, dust, and the distant city. The stars glimmered overhead, indifferent yet eternal, their constellations reflecting the passage of countless generations, wars, and pilgrims who had come before. Silence dominated, punctuated only by occasional movement, a sentinel's footfall, the scrape of a siege tower's wheel, the distant bark of a guard dog, or the quiet curses of a man adjusting armor or tending to an injured companion. The interplay of human expectancy, environmental stillness, and spiritual focus created a sense of suspended time, as if the entire world had paused to witness the events poised to unfold at first light. Leaders, fully aware of the gravity of the coming assault, moved among their men with a balance of authority, reassurance, and strategy. Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse ensured that orders were clear, contingents aligned, and positions of attack planned. Every detail mattered: the placement of ladders, the timing of coordinated assaults, the rotation of archers, and the organization of reserve units. Yet despite meticulous planning, the ultimate outcome remained uncertain, dependent upon the soldiers' endurance, the defenders' reaction, and in the minds of many, the intervention of divine will. The night was a final moment of preparation, reflection, and gathering strength before the full weight of action descended with the sunrise. Thus, the night before the storm was a moment of paradox, one of exhaustion and alertness, silence and expectation, despair and hope. Soldiers lay upon the bare ground, their bodies battered and minds racing, yet their hearts held the collective memory of every hardship overcome and every mile endured. Beneath the stars, with Jerusalem looming on the horizon, the Crusaders slept fitfully, whispered prayers mingling with the desert wind, knowing that with dawn they would confront the city that had dominated centuries of devotion, imagination, and struggle. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if heaven itself awaited to see who would prevail when the first rays of sunlight illuminated the walls and the banners of the Crusaders rose for the final assault. On the morning of July 15th, 1099, the first rays of sun stretched across the hills surrounding Jerusalem, casting a harsh light over the red-tinted soil and the fortress city that had dominated the Crusaders' thoughts for months. The air, already thick with anticipation, carried the mingled scents of dust, sweat, smoke, and fear. Silence, heavy and almost unnatural after weeks of siege preparations, gave way to the creaking of towers being rolled into position, the rhythmic pounding of hammers as final adjustments were made to ladders and siege engines, and the measured commands of officers coordinating the final assault. Every soldier, from the seasoned knight to the weary foot soldier, was acutely aware that this day would define both the culmination of their journey and the measure of their endurance, faith, and resolve. The Crusaders' approach was deliberate yet inexorably forceful. Formations shifted into attack positions under the leadership of Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto. Siege towers, precarious yet ingeniously constructed from timber scavenged from the surrounding hills, were positioned against the outer walls, ladders were placed, archers readied, and the infantry prepared to surge forward at the signal. Despite exhaustion and months of deprivation, every man knew that hesitation or misstep could doom the assault. The physical effort required was immense, scaling ladders under enemy fire, heaving siege equipment, and maintaining cohesion under the relentless sun and the chaos of battle demanded the full measure of both body and spirit. The defenders of Jerusalem were equally resolute. Soldiers, militia, and citizens worked tirelessly to reinforce walls, pour boiling oil, and launch projectiles at the advancing Crusaders. Every gate, tower, and parapet became a locus of resistance, each assault repelled with a combination of strategy, desperation, and intimate knowledge of the city's fortifications. From the rooftops, defenders hurled stones and arrows, attempting to disrupt the attackers' coordination, while hidden passages within the city allowed for sudden sallies intended to sow confusion. The struggle was an interplay of endurance, skill, and chance, magnified by the extreme heat, the fatigue of months of siege, and the psychological pressure of confronting a city imbued with religious and historical significance. The first breaches occurred at points where siege towers met the walls and ladders provided access to the battlements. Crusaders poured forward, climbing into the city with a mixture of adrenaline, fear, and religious fervor. Combat within the streets of Jerusalem was chaotic, brutal, and close quarters. Swords clashed, axes struck with relentless force, and the cries of the wounded and dying echoed off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of history. Buildings, narrow alleys, and stairways became battlegrounds, constraining movements and amplifying the intensity of combat. Knights, trained in open field engagements, adapted to this urban warfare through instinct and necessity, while infantry and pilgrims pressed forward with a determination fueled as much by months of hardship as by the perceived sanction of divine purpose. As the day progressed, the city gradually succumbed to the Crusaders' persistence. Walls were scaled, gates forced open, and key defensive positions captured. Yet victory came at an immense human cost. The streets ran with blood, and the line between combatants and civilians often blurred in the chaos. Chroniclers of the time described the simultaneous exhilaration and horror experienced by those within the city and those watching from the surrounding hills. The realization of triumph in the face of months of struggle was inseparable from the stark awareness of human suffering. For the Crusaders, the achievement of reaching Jerusalem was intertwined with the immediate, visceral consequences of urban conquest, destruction, death, and the overwhelming weight of moral and spiritual reflection. Psychologically, the fall of Jerusalem was both affirmation and torment. Soldiers and pilgrims who had endured frost, famine, disease, and months of siege now stood within the city they had longed for, a place imbued with sacred history and spiritual significance. The culmination of their journey provided an overwhelming sense of purpose fulfilled. Yet the methods and immediate consequences of the assault, the carnage, the devastation of homes, and the mingling of sacred ambition with human violence, complicated that triumph. The boundaries between sacred mission and profane action blurred beneath the harsh sun, leaving many to reconcile feelings of devotion, triumph, and guilt. For leaders, the challenge was not only consolidating control over the city but also managing both the practical realities of occupation and the moral implications of actions taken in its capture. The city's sacred spaces, temples and mosques became focal points both for victory and for reflection. Crusaders paused in key locations, raising banners and offering prayers, while chaplains and priests moved among the army, administering blessings, attending the wounded, and recording the monumental events unfolding around them. Each act, whether of violence, devotion, or survival, was imbued with the knowledge that history would remember this day in complex, often contradictory ways. The streets, alleys, and plazas of Jerusalem, once spaces of daily life and worship, had become stages upon which the intertwining of human aspiration, religious devotion, and brutal conflict played out in a concentrated, unforgettable drama. By evening, the city was firmly in Crusader hands, though the aftermath was a scene of profound exhaustion, reflection, and muted triumph. Fires from earlier assaults smoldered in streets and buildings, smoke mingled with dust and the faint scent of blood, and the surviving defenders had either surrendered or fled. Soldiers tended the wounded, gathered the dead, and sought moments of quiet amidst the ruins to pray, rest, or contemplate the enormity of what had been accomplished. Jerusalem, for centuries the focal point of religious devotion and geopolitical conflict, now stood as both a realized dream and a stark reminder of the costs exacted to achieve it, a place where triumph and suffering, sacred and profane, existed side by side beneath the relentless light of the Levantine sun. The fall of Jerusalem marked the culmination of the First Crusade's most arduous journey from the frozen plains of Anatolia to the dead cities of Syria, through the hills of Judea, and finally into the city itself. It was a moment of fulfillment, reflection, and sobering reckoning. Soldiers and pilgrims had endured unimaginable hardships, yet the city's capture revealed both the power and the peril inherent in human ambition intertwined with religious zeal. The streets ran with the mingled currents of victory, devotion, and devastation, and every individual within the army was left to reconcile the long path traveled with the immediate reality of the city's conquest. In the shadow of its walls, the Crusaders confronted not only the culmination of their physical and spiritual journey, but also the enduring complexity of history, faith, and the human condition. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, languid shadows across the walls and streets of Jerusalem, the immediate chaos of conquest began to fade. The city, once alive with the tension of defense and the echoes of battle, now lay silent save for the occasional creak of a shutter, the distant movement of a surviving animal, or the whisper of wind as it swept across dust-laden streets and empty courtyards. Those who had endured the months-long journey, the sieges, the relentless march from Europe through Anatolia, the dead cities and the hills of Judea, finally allowed themselves a moment of repose, their bodies still trembling with exhaustion, their minds heavy with the weight of what had been witnessed and enacted. Victory, realized at the cost of countless lives and immeasurable suffering, now hung over the city like a profound and solemn presence, demanding reflection as much as acknowledgement. The streets of Jerusalem bore witness to both human ingenuity and human tragedy. Buildings that had once housed families, merchants, and pilgrims were scarred, partially destroyed, or emptied of life. Fires which had raged during the assaults smoldered quietly, their smoke now mingling with the red dust that coated every surface. The city's fountains, wells, and cisterns, previously contested points during the siege, were now still, their waters reflecting the pale evening light. The scent of battle had begun to dissipate, replaced by the dust and warmth of a city temporarily subdued, though the memory of the struggle remained embedded in every stone, every alleyway, and every archway. For the survivors, the visual and sensory imprint of the siege would persist long after physical wounds had healed, a constant reminder of both human ambition and human vulnerability. Leadership, having ensured the capture and initial control of the city, now faced the immense responsibility of organizing what remained into a functioning, if fragile, political entity. Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse confronted not only the task of securing their positions, but also of maintaining discipline among an army that had been simultaneously inspired by faith and hardened by months of deprivation. The city itself, stripped by siege, looting, and flight, required urgent management. Essential resources, including food, water, and shelter, had to be accounted for. Security needed to be re-established to prevent outbreaks of disorder, and the delicate balance between military necessity and religious purpose had to be maintained. This blending of administration and survival, of power and morality, reflected the broader challenge inherent in translating martial victory into sustainable authority. Spiritually, the moment was complex. For the Crusaders, Jerusalem represented the apex of aspiration, the fulfillment of centuries of devotion, and the personal, physical, and psychological sacrifices made over the course of years. Pilgrims knelt at the stones of sacred sites, offering prayers of thanks and reflection, while chaplains moved silently through the streets, providing guidance, consolation, and a reminder of the divine significance ascribed to the city. Yet alongside these acts of devotion, existed an unspoken reckoning with the violence required to secure the city, the blood shed in the streets, the homes destroyed, and the lives extinguished in both combatant and civilian populations. Victory was inseparable from grief, triumph intertwined with reflection and unease, the sacred mingling inseparably with the profane. The physical and emotional exhaustion of the Crusaders became apparent in subtle ways. Soldiers collapsed into the dust, some quietly weeping, others silently staring at the walls they had fought to scale. Pilgrims, their clothes tattered, feet blistered, and bodies sunburned, walked the streets in a slow, almost ritualized procession, touching stones, crosses, or remnants of sacred buildings. Leaders, though burdened with the task of organization, occasionally paused to witness the collective endurance of the men, the monumental achievement realized through relentless perseverance, and the profound cost paid in the pursuit of faith. The juxtaposition of human triumph and human frailty created a landscape of contemplation as palpable as the physical city itself. Time, both immediate and historical, seemed suspended in these moments. The wind carried the echoes of battle, mingling with the prayers and chants of the faithful, the low murmurs of the exhausted, and the creak of siege towers now dismantled or abandoned. Every step through the streets revealed the imprint of human labor, suffering, and faith, the marks of siege engines, the stones scarred by combat, and the faint traces of those who had fled or fallen. Memory became a tangible presence, as vivid as the physical environment, a reminder that the city's capture was both a culmination and a transformation, of territory, of human experience, and of collective consciousness. The establishment of the nascent Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, emerging from the ruins and silence, was thus both practical and symbolic. Structures were repurposed for governance, religious observances, and military control. Settlements outside the immediate walls were monitored and fortified, and a fragile hierarchy of authority was implemented to manage both immediate security and the long-term stability of the conquered city. Yet beneath the practical measures, an enduring awareness persisted among the survivors that the events of July 1099 had irrevocably changed the city, themselves, and the region. The kingdom that emerged was not merely a political or military entity, but a testament to endurance, faith, and the complex interplay of human ambition, devotion, and mortality. In the hours following the cessation of organized combat, the Crusaders allowed themselves the rare luxury of quiet observation. Streets, once thick with movement and conflict, were now still, save for the occasional murmur of a sentinel or the distant rustle of wind through olive trees and debris. Survivors walked slowly, touched the remnants of sacred spaces, or simply sat upon the warm stones of streets and plazas, breathing in the stillness of a city transformed. The air itself seemed to hold a memory, carrying whispers of struggle, prayer, and devotion, imprinting upon those who remained a sense of awe, humility, and the sobering magnitude of human endeavor and mortality. Thus, the First Crusade came to its conclusion, not in celebration alone, but in reflection, endurance, and solemn acknowledgement of both triumph and cost. The city, now under the control of the Crusaders, represented a kingdom born of dust, blood, and memory, a territory forged through suffering, aspiration, and faith. Survivors did not revel loudly in conquest. They simply breathed, attended to necessities, and allowed the enormity of the journey and its consequences to settle over them, like the gentle yet persistent weight of desert wind. Jerusalem, long imagined and long sought, had become real, tangible, and transformed, a sacred city, a political entity, and a monument to the complex, interwoven narrative of human ambition, devotion, endurance, and the passage of time. In that stillness of holy dust, the echoes of the crusade lingered, shaping the memory of all who had lived through it, and leaving an indelible mark upon history itself.